Welcome to Japan True Stories. Tonight, a quiet story from Japan. Settle in. Somewhere between what was once promised and what quietly remained, ordinary people carried feelings they could never quite put into words. Breathe with them now. Somewhere in the mountains, on a night in late spring when the air had not yet decided to be truly warm, a young man named Kenji was making his way down a corridor he was reasonably certain he recognized. He was 26 years old, and he had spent the last several hours in the private dining room of a mountain inn with 4 of his oldest friends, drinking cold beer and warm sake and eating things that tasted the way food tastes when the evening has been long and good and the altitude makes everything feel a little more than it is. The inn was the old-fashioned sort, narrow hallways that smelled of cedar and clean tatami, where the floorboards made soft sounds underfoot and the paper screens along the corridor held a warm amber glow from the lanterns set low inside each room. It had been a fine evening, all of them crowded around a lacquered table that was slightly too small for the number of people sitting at it, the way fine evenings usually arrange themselves, the bottles appearing and disappearing in a gentle tide, the conversation going nowhere particular and meaning everything. And now Kenji was walking back alone, because he had reached that particular stage of the evening where the floor had acquired a very slight tilt, and the simplest thought required a small, careful effort to complete. His friends had wanted to keep going, of course, they were in fine form, ordering one more round with the cheerful certainty of men who would deeply regret it in the morning and didn't mind at all yet, but Kenji had excused himself, because somewhere underneath the warm blur of the evening there was still a quiet part of him that understood when enough was enough. He had collected his slippers from the step outside the dining room, wrapped his yukata a little more firmly around himself, the thin cotton inrobe they had all changed into after the communal hot spring bath, which was the kind of garment that looked dignified on everyone in the bathing area and considerably less dignified in the bright light of the hallway after several drinks, and turned toward what he was quite sure was the direction of his room. Room 214, his key said, and the corridor stretched ahead of him in its warm amber light, every door looking very much like every other door, which was the sort of thing you didn't notice or didn't mind until, quite suddenly, it became relevant. He walked slowly and with some concentration, trailing one hand along the smooth wall as a kind of anchor, reading the small paper plaques outside each room as he passed, the numbers swimming slightly under his attention, each one requiring a fraction more focus than it should have needed. He stopped at a door, and looked at the plaque for a moment, and it said what he was fairly sure was his number, or something close enough to his number that the distinction seemed, in that moment, unimportant, and he slid it open with the practiced ease of a man returning to somewhere familiar, stepped inside, and let out a long, quiet breath of relief. The room was dark, or nearly dark, the only light was a thin pale stripe falling through the shoji screen from somewhere outside, perhaps a lamp in the inn's small rock garden, perhaps the glow of the sign at the mountain road's turning, and it laid itself across the tatami in a long, silver line that went nowhere and illuminated nothing in particular. There was a futon laid out in the center of the room, turned back at one corner the way the inn staff had promised when they checked in that afternoon, and Kenji looked at it with the particular gratitude of a person who has made it home and feels the fact of home in their bones. He sat down on the edge of it, and the room did a slow, gentle turn around him, and the futon was thick and clean and smelled of the fresh cedar that the mountains here seemed to use for everything, and he thought with some satisfaction that he had made a correct decision by leaving his friends when he had. He lay back, pulled the folded corner of the blanket across himself without quite managing to unfurl it all the way, which he decided would be fine, closed his eyes, and the ceiling, or the general area where the ceiling presumably was, began its slow, stately rotation above him. The sounds of the inn came softly through the walls, the distant creak of a floorboard as another guest moved somewhere down the corridor, the low hum of the vending machine at the hallway's far end, and underneath it all, the thin and muffled sound of his friends still going, their voices and laughter carried to him through the building's old walls as something warm and diminished and belonging to another version of the same night. It was pleasant, lying there with his eyes closed and those sounds around him, the sense of an evening continuing somewhere else while he had already, sensibly, stepped out of it, and the pillow was soft and the mountain air came cool at the edges of the room, and Kenji drifted downward into sleep with very little ceremony and almost no warning. He would say later that he had no memory of the transition at all, that one moment he was lying there listening to the vending machine hum and the next moment something woke him, which was probably true, and was possibly also a kindness from a brain that had decided the less it retained of this particular night the better for everyone. What woke him was a sound that did not belong to any dream, not the theatrical kind of sound that belongs to movies, pitched and timed for effect, but the real sort, the immediate and involuntary sort. The kind a person makes when their body reacts before their mind has had a chance to assess the situation and suggest composure. It came from very close, from within the same room, from roughly 1.5 meters to his left, and it was followed immediately by the sound of feet on tatami, quick and light, and then gone, and then the sliding door being pulled open with considerable force, and then footsteps down the corridor, fast and fading. Kenji sat up, pressing one hand into the futon for steadiness, and opened his eyes to a room full of wrong things. He knew it the way you know, in dreams, when the familiar place rearranges itself into something almost right but not quite. The window was on the wrong side, the bag in the corner was not his bag, and the small careful arrangement of toiletries on the low dresser belonged to someone else entirely, placed with a precision he could not have managed after the evening he'd had. He sat there for a moment while the understanding assembled itself, piece by piece, with the slow and unwilling efficiency of a mind that has not fully woken up and would prefer not to reach the conclusion that was becoming unavoidable. He had walked past his room. He had read a number wrong in the amber light of the corridor, or perhaps not read it at all, having reached the point in the evening where recognition replaced reading, and he had opened a door that was not his door, and he had lain down in a futon that had been prepared not for him but for someone else, someone who was, at this precise moment, standing in the corridor of a mountain inn in the small hours of a spring night, having been woken from sleep by the presence of an unknown man in her room. And that was when he became fully aware of the yukata. Or rather, of the state the yukata was in. The garment had come substantially open at some point during either the walk or the sleeping, and the effect was such that Kenji was, in all practical terms, wearing very little, and the very little he was wearing was arranged in a way that would not have been improved by description. He sat there on someone else's futon in someone else's room, wearing almost nothing, and from the corridor came the low and measured voices of inn staff arriving, as the staff of a well-run mountain inn will, with calm and rapid efficiency, when something requires attending to. He retied the yukata as carefully as his hands would manage, stood up with as much dignity as the situation permitted, which was not very much but was something, slid the door open, and went out into the corridor to face what was waiting. What was waiting was two members of the inn's staff, a young woman and an older man, both maintaining the particular expression of professional composure that the hospitality industry trains for exactly these situations, their faces conveying calm management while their eyes conveyed quite a lot else besides. And a little further down the corridor, standing near the wall with one hand pressed flat against her sternum in the way people stand when they have just remembered how to breathe, was the young woman who had been asleep in that room. She was in her early 20s, her hair pressed flat from the pillow on the side where she'd been lying, her own yukata entirely and correctly tied, and she was looking at Kenji with an expression that contained several things at once, things he was not, in his present state, quite equipped to fully catalogue. The staff escorted him, gently, firmly, with the particular care of people who are very skilled at moving awkward situations toward resolution without drawing further attention to them in a public space, to the front area near the main desk, where the matter was discussed in voices low enough that no other guests would be troubled by it. Kenji apologized. He apologized to the staff with the earnest, slightly stiff apology of a man who is sober enough to understand fully what has happened but still a little too blurred at the edges to manage eloquence, and then the staff brought him to where the young woman was standing. Yui, though he did not know her name yet, would not learn it until much later, and he bowed to her. Not the brief, automatic bow of a minor inconvenience, not the polite dip of a person going through motions, but the low, floor-directed bow that carries its own particular weight. The bow that his grandfather had once described as the bow of genuine contrition, the one that says not simply I am sorry but I understand that sorry is not enough and I am bowing anyway because there is nothing else left to offer. He held it. The room was quiet while he held it, and after a long moment Yui said something in a low, careful voice that the older staff member relayed to him as, more or less. She accepted, provided that this never happened again, and that he kept himself at the maximum distance the building's floor plan allowed for whatever remained of their stay. This seemed to Kenji entirely reasonable, more than reasonable, far more generous than the circumstances demanded, and he agreed with the sincerity of a man who intends never, under any circumstances, to be anywhere near a door numbered anywhere close to 212 again for the remainder of his natural life. The staff, after a murmured consultation near the front desk that involved a certain amount of careful glancing in his direction, concluded that the police did not need to be called, and this conclusion arrived at Kenji as a relief so complete he felt it settle into the backs of his knees. There had been a real possibility, he had understood this even through the blur of the evening, that the night could have ended somewhere much harsher and much brighter, with officials and forms and the kind of fluorescent-lit explanations that follow you around afterward, and instead it was ending here, in the cedar-scented warmth of a mountain-in lobby, with a bow accepted and a quiet door closing on the incident. He was shown by the older staff member to the correct room, which was, as he had privately suspected, and did not say aloud 2 doors down from the room he had entered, the numbers on the small paper plaques being quite legible in daylight and very nearly indistinguishable in the amber and shadow light of the corridor at that hour, after that particular evening. His futon was there, exactly as the staff had left it, turned down at precisely one corner, patient and undisturbed, everything as it should have been from the beginning. He lay down on his own futon, properly situated this time, the correct window on the correct side, and stared at the paper screen above him, and did not feel at all like sleeping, which seemed fair. The mountain outside was very quiet. In spring, when the upper slopes are still coming slowly back to green and the nights carry the cold memory of winter in their lower registers, there is a quality to mountain silence that is different from city silence, not the silence of things that have stopped but of things that have been still for a very long time, which is a different kind of quiet and, when you are in the right frame of mind, a considerably quieter one. Kenji listened to it, and the embarrassment sat with him the way a stone sits, not going anywhere, not requiring anything particular, simply there, occupying its space. He found himself thinking about the sound that had woken him, the real, unguarded thing, the sound a person makes when their body reacts before their mind has had a chance to reach for composure, and about the hand pressed flat against her sternum in the corridor afterward, and about the expression on her face, which had been the look of someone who had been genuinely frightened, not by anything dramatic or interesting but by the flat and disorienting fact of waking up to find a stranger in her room in the dark. He had caused that for someone. Through the straightforward, unromantic failure of not reading a number correctly in a dimly lit corridor, through the small and thoroughly ordinary human carelessness of believing he knew where he was going when he did not, he had caused that specific moment for a specific person who had had no part in it and hadn't asked to be there. He sat with this understanding without trying to argue himself away from it, which was, though he didn't know it at the time, one of the better things he would do in quite a while. After some time, the feelings began to settle, the way feelings do when you stop pressing on them, not disappearing, not resolving, simply taking a shape that is smaller and quieter and easier to carry than the shape they had when everything was fresh. He was 26 years old, and he had done a careless thing, and the consequences had been managed, and the young woman down the corridor would sleep again before morning, and in time this would become a story she told rather than something she felt, and that was, in the end, the most he could hope for. He thought, before sleep came back for him, about the way she had stood in the corridor, composed and tired and precise in the way she held herself, even in the middle of something she had every right to be furious about, and he found himself hoping, with no particular right to the feeling, that the rest of her night would be undisturbed. It was the smallest and most useless wish, and he held it anyway, loosely, the way you hold the last thought before sleep, not gripping it, just letting it rest there while the mountain air moved at the edges of the room and the vending machine at the far end of the corridor kept its single, faithful, humming note. He pulled the blanket properly over himself this time, both corners, all the way up, the way you do it when you mean it, and closed his eyes, and the ceiling remained still and quiet above him, which felt like a small and reasonable mercy. Sleep came back gently, without drama, and the inn settled deeper into its mountain night quiet around him, and the spring dark outside went on doing what spring dark in the mountains does, slow and indifferent and older than anyone in the building, older than the building itself. Kenji slept, and Yui slept, or found her way back to sleep, in their separate rooms along the same corridor, and neither of them knew yet, lying there in the cedar-smelling dark with the mountain quiet around them, that this night, this awkward, embarrassing, thoroughly poorly managed night, was not an end of anything but the first tentative line of something that hadn't been written yet. But that is a story for other evenings, told slowly, in their own time. For now there is just the mountain, and the quiet, and the soft sound of the spring coming in at the edges of the shoji screen, and two strangers in their separate rooms finding their way, each in their own way, back to sleep. And that is more than enough, for a first chapter, and a good and gentle place to rest. And so we leave that hallway behind, its shadows settling quietly, its voices fading like breath on a winter window. There is no hurry here. If you need to, let your body sink a little deeper into where you are resting, let your shoulders release, let the darkness behind your eyes grow soft and wide. The same night is still unfolding around us, the same still hours stretching gently outward, and our next story waits just ahead, unhurried, already beginning its slow drift toward you. Take one slow breath in, and let it go. We are in no rush at all. Somewhere in the small mountain inn, morning was arriving slowly, not all at once, the way mornings sometimes do in the city, but seeping in under the edges of the paper screen in that tentative, particular way, more suggestion than light, more stillness than sound. Kenji lay on a futon that was not his, in a room that was not his, wearing almost nothing, which was, as he was now understanding with painful clarity, part of the problem. The sake had done its work and left, the way sake does, and in its place was ordinary wakefulness, with all its unhelpful precision, sharpening the events of the night into something he could see very clearly and could not unc. He had come into the wrong room. Pause. He had believed, walking down the corridor in the dark and the late-night blur of too many drinks, that he was reading the number on the door correctly, and he had been wrong, and the futon had been there, and he had been so very tired, and none of this was particularly useful to think about now. What was useful to think about was what happened next, which required considerably more from him than the night had. He sat up, pulling the yukata closed around himself with the deliberateness of someone who has recently learned not to take such things for granted, and he sat on the edge of the unfamiliar futon and listened to the inn going about its morning without him. A door at the far end of the corridor, a low exchange of voices, the brief and indifferent sound of running water. Breath. And then the knock came. Not the hesitant knock of someone uncertain of their welcome, this was a knock that knew precisely where it was and had been preparing itself since at least 3 in the morning. He said, from inside the room, that yes, he was there. He was unambiguously there. The door slid open, and 2 members of the inn staff stepped in, an older woman with close-cropped grey hair and the precise, composed bearing of someone who had spent decades turning difficult situations back into manageable ones, and behind her a younger man who said nothing, whose silence was doing most of his communicating for him. The older woman looked at Kenji the way someone looks at a situation they have already fully assessed and are now in the process of addressing, not cruel, not theatrical, just thoroughly clear. Pause. She spoke quietly. A raised voice, Kenji thought, might have been easier. In its way, a raised voice has a shape you can respond to, edges you can push against. This voice had no edges. It was even and unhurried, and it simply filled the room, and the only thing he could do was sit inside it. She told him, precisely, what had happened, which he knew, but hearing it recounted from the outside was a different and more clarifying experience than knowing it from within. The wrong room, the open yukata, the guest who had come back to what she believed was her own room and had found instead a stranger in her bed, and the screaming, and the whole unfortunate sequence of it laid out with the measured care of someone who will not allow the details to be soft-pedaled. She told him what this establishment expected of its guests. She told him how far the previous evening's events had traveled from that expectation. Kenji nodded at intervals, and he did not attempt to explain, because somewhere in the first moments of her speaking he had understood, with something almost approaching relief in its clarity, that explanation was not what this required. Pause. The younger staff member continued to stand behind her and continued to say nothing, and his silence had by now acquired a weight of its own, a quiet witnessing that was somehow more present than words would have been. The older woman finished. She said that the guest in question would be consulted, and that he should prepare himself, and that they would return. And the door slid closed, and Kenji sat alone in someone else's room in the pale morning light, and waited. Waiting, in circumstances like these, is not the comfortable sort. It is the waiting of someone who has done a thing they cannot undo and is now simply at the mercy of what other people decide to do in response to it, which is a position that removes every illusion of control that a person normally carries through their day without noticing. He waited while the light through the paper screen grew slightly warmer and the sounds of the inn shifted from the sparse quiet of very early morning into something that resembled the beginning of a day, footsteps with more purpose, the sound of trays being carried somewhere, voices at a normal conversational register in rooms he could hear but not see. Breath. He thought about his friends, still asleep in their room, the correct room, entirely unaware that any of this was happening, dreaming whatever uncomplicated dreams friends dream when they have not spent the night in the wrong person's bed. He thought briefly about what he would say to them afterward. He put that thought away for later. When the knock returned and the door opened, the older woman was there again, and something in her bearing had settled into decision, and she told him, "Come with us." He followed. The corridor of the inn was clean and quiet, polished wood underfoot, paper screens on either side behind which the sounds of other guests' mornings continued in small domestic fragments, someone turning a tap, a low cough, the soft sounds of a bag being closed. Halfway down the corridor, on a low shelf against the wall, there was a small ikebana arrangement, white blossoms in a simple ceramic vessel, the kind of modest, careful beauty that well-kept inns tend to maintain without drawing attention to themselves. Pause. Kenji noticed this with the heightened attention of someone in a state of considerable self-consciousness, taking in small details the way a person does when they are trying to keep their mind somewhere manageable. His socked feet made no sound on the floor. He was aware of himself in a way that was nearly physical, the yukata re-tied with all the care he could manage, his hair almost certainly a catastrophe, his hands held in front of him in that uncertain gathering that hands go to when you need them to signal something and you have not yet decided what. They stopped outside a door. The older woman knocked, different this time, measured and careful, the knock of someone who asks before entering, and from inside the room came a brief, quiet sound of acknowledgement. The door slid open. Yui was at the low table near the window, her hands around a cup of tea, the pale morning light coming through the paper screen behind her in a way that gave the room the stillness of a painting, composed, considered, every edge softened. Pause. She looked up. Kenji had not, in the chaos and the screaming of the night before, actually seen her face. He had seen a shape, a movement, the impression of someone leaving very quickly in a state of considerable alarm, and he saw it now, younger than he had somehow expected, composed, watching him with an expression that was not the fury he had perhaps prepared himself for, and not the lingering aftermath of fear, but something more difficult and more settled than either. It was the expression of someone who is taking stock. The older woman spoke, in the careful formal register of the situation, explaining that the gentleman had something he wished to say and had requested this opportunity. She looked at Kenji. The look said, "Now." He had thought, walking down the corridor, about the right words, the precise combination of sincerity and context, and perhaps a little of the unfortunate circumstance of it all, the dark hallway, the similar-looking numbers, the sake, and he had assembled and quietly disassembled several versions of a speech in the time it had taken to reach this room. Standing in Yui's doorway now, with the morning light coming through the paper screen and Yui watching him with that measuring, unhurried expression, he understood all at once that he was wrong about the words. Breath. He knelt. Not the ordinary kneeling of sitting down for a conversation, he went all the way, the full dejeza, the complete prostration. Forehead pressed to the tatami mat, hands flat on either side of his face, his whole body folded down as low as a person can be and still be inside a room, the bow that in Japan carries within it not merely apology but a giving over of pride, of position, of the comfortable fictions a person carries about themselves in recognition of a genuine wrong. Pause. The tatami was cool against his forehead. He noticed this with the particular sharpness that extreme moments sometimes lend to small physical details, the precise coolness of it, the slight give of the woven surface under his palms, the clean dry smell of rice straw and the inn's carefully maintained air, the way the pressure against his forehead was immediate and grounding in a way that everything else in that moment was not. He was aware of the room's sounds, the soft shift of fabric as Yui moved slightly in her chair, the near-inaudible presence of the older woman near the door, the muffled and indifferent continuation of the inn's mourning on the other side of the paper screen, ordinary sounds, proceeding without any awareness of what was happening inside this room. He breathed, and kept breathing, and let the position do what words could not. Pause. He apologized. He did not explain, this was not a moment for explanation, which is a kind of reframing, a small implicit request that the other person hold your circumstances alongside the fact of what happened, and soften accordingly. He set all of that aside. He said, from the floor, with his forehead on her tatami, that he had entered the wrong room, that this was not an excuse but simply a fact, and that he was deeply and genuinely sorry for the fright he had caused her, for the intrusion, for all of it. He said that he had not meant harm. He said that he knew there was no particular reason she should take him at his word. He stayed on the floor. Pause. The room held itself around him, the morning light continuing its slow, indifferent work through the paper screen, the teacup sitting on the table, the older woman near the door with the patient stillness of someone who has waited out harder things than this and will wait this one out too. There is a silence that is tense, that is held breath and suspended judgment, and there is a silence that is deciding, and the two feel entirely different to someone with their face pressed against a tatami mat, reading the room entirely through sound and the quality of the air. This silence, after a moment, felt like the second kind. Breath. Yui set her teacup down, he heard the small soft sound of it, porcelain placed carefully on wood, and then the fabric of her clothing shifted as she moved, and the room was still again, and then she spoke. She asked him, quietly, whether he understood what the previous night had been like from her side of it. He said, from the floor, that he thought he did. He said that he thought he understood it rather better now than he had at any earlier point wanted to. She spoke then, not at great length, but steadily, in the tone of someone setting something down that they have been carrying and that has become, in the carrying, its own kind of weight. Pause. She had come back to her room expecting nothing more startling than her own belongings and the ordinary end of an ordinary evening, and instead she had opened a door in the dark and found a stranger, and had been frightened in a way that went somewhat beyond what the word alone could carry. She said it without drama, without any performance of grievance. That was, in a way, what made it reach him. He said that he was sorry. Pause. He said it quietly, from the floor, and meant it in all the ways it is possible to mean something you cannot fully understand from the inside but are attempting, very sincerely, to hold from the outside. He said it again. The older woman spoke then, briefly and formally, summarizing what had been discussed, that the guest had been asked whether she wished to contact the authorities, and that she had said she would first hear what the gentleman had to offer. There was a pause. Pause. And then Yui said, without looking at him, in a voice that had already made its decision and was simply now delivering it, she would not call the police. She said it the way a door closes when someone has been carrying something heavy and has finally set it down, not with relief exactly, but with the quiet finality of a thing that has been resolved, a direction chosen and committed to. The older woman nodded once, a brief, efficient nod, the nod of someone making note of a conclusion. Kenji, still on the floor, thanked her with everything he had available, which at that moment was not a great deal, and which had to be enough. He was eventually permitted to sit back on his heels, and he stayed that way for some time before he stood somewhere between kneeling and sitting, which felt appropriate even after the sharpest portion of the morning had passed. What followed was the quiet business of resolution, guided by the older woman with the careful efficiency of someone closing a room after a difficult event, a few formal exchanges, the establishing of what had been decided, the general tidying up of a situation that nobody had wanted and that had now, through some improbable cooperation, been brought to a close. Pause. The younger staff member brought tea at some point, not for Kenji, which was correct. Nobody specifically suggested tea for Kenji, but the arrival of tea at all felt like a small and wordless signal that the room had returned from somewhere difficult toward something approaching ordinary. Yui received her tea without comment, and looked toward the window, and allowed the rest of the conversation to resolve itself around her with a quiet that Kenji found, even in that moment, quietly remarkable. Before it was over, she spoke once more. She said, not looking at him, that she accepted his apology, and that she would prefer, if possible, not to think about any of it again. He told her that he understood completely, and that he was grateful, and that he would not trouble her further. He meant all three. Pause. The older woman walked him back down the corridor, past the flower arrangement, past the low lamp still glowing faintly near a window despite the morning, past all the closed doors behind which other guests were having entirely normal stays at this inn, and she said, once, near the door of his own room, that he had conducted himself with appropriate sincerity. It was not praise, exactly. But it was, perhaps, the closest thing to a verdict the morning was going to offer, and he received it quietly. She left. He stood at his own door for a moment before going in. Inside, the futon had been straightened while he was gone, the room looking exactly as it should, as though the night had been filed away neatly, which was rather more than Kenji could currently say for his own internal arrangement of it. Pause. He sat on the edge of his futon and looked at the paper screen. The light was warm, and even now, the milky tentativeness of early dawn resolved into something clear and settled, the kind of morning light that makes surfaces look clean and the air feel like a day that has not yet been used for anything. He sat for a long time, long enough for the sounds of the inn to find their rhythm around him, voices becoming distinct, trays carried somewhere with purpose, the building settling into the ordinary business of a morning. Breath. He thought about the tatami against his forehead, about the coolness of it, and how it had been an anchor, something real and immediate when everything else was the uneasy texture of consequence, and about the smell of it, rice straw and dry clean air, the particular scent of a floor that has been well cared for. He thought about Yui's voice, the steadiness of it, the decision she had made, and how she had delivered it, not as a gesture or a gift, not with any requirement that the moment recognize her generosity, but simply as a conclusion, offered without drama, needing nothing in return. She had not needed to do it that way. She had simply done it that way. Pause. He did not know her name. He knew nothing about her, except the posture at the low table and the hands around the teacup and the expression that had watched him through all of it with a seriousness that the situation deserved and that he had, perhaps, not entirely anticipated. He did not think he would see her again. There was no particular reason he should. The inn, the trip, the ordinary machinery of separate lives would carry them in their separate directions, and this strange morning would fold itself into the past where all mornings eventually go. He would tell this story to his friends, eventually, in the voice that turns survived misfortune into something usable, the slight softening of edges that happens when enough time and distance accumulate between now and then. He could already feel it beginning, the slow conversion of what was real into what was recountable, the anecdote assembling itself at the edges of the experience. Pause. But sitting here now, in the ordinary light of a morning he had not exactly earned, he let it be what it actually was for a little longer. Not funny yet. Pause. Just real, and a little strange, and holding underneath the mortification, underneath the relief, something quiet he could not quite name. A recognition, maybe, of what it had cost him to stay on that floor, and a corresponding sense of what it had cost her, on the other side of the room, to say what she had said. The paper screen shifted briefly as a cloud moved somewhere outside, the light going soft and grey for a moment before returning to gold. Kenji sat in the warmth of it, breathing, letting the morning settle around the edges of everything that had happened. Somewhere down the corridor, in a room where the same paper screen was glowing with the same morning light, a woman named Yui finished the last of her tea and looked out at the mountains and thought her own thoughts about the unexpected strangeness of other people. What those thoughts were, only she could say. And so the morning continued, patient and unhurried, gathering up the strange small events of the night and folding them, quietly, into the ordinary fabric of a day. That was the end of it. Or so both of them, at the time, had every reason to believe. And so we leave that hallway behind, its quiet tensions dissolving now like breath on cold glass, fading gently into the dark. There is no hurry here. If you need a moment, take it, let your shoulders settle a little deeper, let your breath come slow and even, soft as rainfall on still water. The same night is still unfolding, the same story continuing, and it will find you right where you are. You have nowhere else to be. The hours ahead belong entirely to rest, and the next voice that meets you will carry you further still, unhurried, unhurried, like a lantern held at arm's length along a path you already know. Somewhere in the hush of a sleeping inn, on a morning that arrived with the mild patience of mornings that know they are going to require some accounting, a young man named Kenji lay on his futon and tried, with incomplete success, not to think too clearly about the night before. The room around him was quiet and unhurried. The light through the paper screens was a soft, non-committal gray, and the only sound from outside was the low percussion of someone in a far corridor with a mop, and in this quietness the events of the previous evening arranged themselves in his memory with a calm, unsparing precision he would have strongly preferred to do without. He had, in the order in which these things had occurred, consumed a significant quantity of sake with his friends, wandered a corridor of the inn with confident misdirection, found his way into a room that was not his room, settled onto a futon that was not his futon, and fallen asleep in the manner of someone who believed, without question, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He had then been woken by a sound he would describe, if pressed, as emphatic, to find himself in the company of a young woman named Yui who had not, evidently, been expecting company. The rest of that sequence, the scrambling, the corridor, the innkeeper with his expression of ancient professional disappointment, the floor and the bowing and the apologizing until the words lost their shape, he would rather not revisit in detail, and yet here it was, revisiting itself anyway, as things tend to do on quiet mornings when the mind has nowhere else it would rather go. His friends, when he had returned to his actual room and explained, had responded in the manner that men who travel together so often do, with that particular breathless laughter that keeps starting up again just when it seems finally to have finished, arriving in waves, pulling each of them forward until someone was essentially just lying on the tatami staring at the ceiling. He had lain on his own futon and listened, and thought that in 10 years, possibly 15, this would be funny to him too, and that 10 years felt, in the moment, like an entirely reasonable starting estimate. The checkout the following morning was not a small challenge. The Ryokan's lobby was not a large space, a polished wooden reception desk, a low arrangement of folded tourist maps near the entrance, that small dish of wrapped sweets that every inn seems to have and that no guest ever quite takes, and Kenji had just come around the corner from the corridor and stepped into it when he stopped moving. Yui was there. She was standing at the reception desk with several of her friends, in the process of checking out, bag over one shoulder, in the middle of saying something to the woman behind the desk, and the slight change in the room made her glance toward the door. She saw Kenji. There was a moment, not a long one, just a breath or two, in which neither of them said anything, and the lobby went very still in the way lobbies do when there is a sudden and unscheduled atmosphere in them. Her face moved through something that happened quickly but that Kenji had time to observe in considerable detail, the way you sometimes have time to observe things you very much wish were not occurring. Surprise first, then recognition, then the gradual arrival of an expression that had the quality of a door, very quietly and very decisively, closing. She looked at him the way you look at something you have found in your coat pocket that you don't remember putting there and are not sure what to do with. Kenji considered, briefly, retreating back down the corridor to wait until she had gone, which was the kind of thought that offers approximately 3 seconds of comfort before the practical reality of luggage and checkout times asserts itself without sympathy. He walked to the desk with the demeanor of a man who had become very interested in the middle distance and was hoping to pass through the next few minutes without attracting particular notice. His friends came filing in behind him with their bags and their residual good humor from the previous night, and at least one of them said something in a low voice that produced muffled sounds from the others, and Kenji felt the back of his neck go warm in the specific way that has nothing to do with the temperature of the room. He kept his eyes on the reception desk while they waited, but was aware, in the way you are sometimes aware of things at the very edge of your attention, that Yui was aware of him in precisely the same way, and that her awareness had considerably more edge to it than his. Her group finished at the desk and moved toward the entrance, and as they passed he heard the sound of murmuring, the particular murmuring of people who are being careful not to look at something while making perfectly clear that they are aware of it, and then the heavy wooden door swung shut behind them and the lobby was ordinary again. His friends offered various remarks, all of them affectionate in the way that remarks you entirely deserve can still be difficult to receive, and then they too gathered their things and stepped outside into the morning, where the air was cool and carried the particular smell of old cedar and the faint mineral trace of the stone path beneath their feet. The men had agreed, more or less without consulting Kenji on the matter, that they should stop at the nearby tourist cluster before catching the afternoon train, and he had no strong argument against this. The morning was genuinely pleasant, a mild and even gray that made the low hills in the distance look soft and approachable, and he was beginning, very carefully, to feel that the worst of the situation was behind him. He had that thought at approximately the moment he needed to find a restroom. Tourist facilities at small regional sites occupy a specific kind of space off the main path, past a low hedge or a stand of bamboo, marked by a hand-painted wooden sign, and the one at this particular site was not especially difficult to locate, and Kenji was walking toward it through the quiet morning with the plain, straightforward intention of a man who needs a restroom and nothing more, when he heard, somewhere up ahead, a cluster of familiar voices. He slowed without quite meaning to. Yui and her friends were standing just in front of the restroom building, gathered in the loose way people gather while waiting for each other, and the one nearest the entrance spotted him first and said something, and then they all looked, and Kenji found himself standing on a gravel path with nowhere reasonable to redirect himself and a row of faces doing a certain kind of rapid arithmetic that he already understood the result of. He understood what they were thinking, and he also understood that there was nothing he could say or do in this moment that would not sound exactly like what someone with the worst possible intentions would say or do, and this understanding had the particular quality of arriving just slightly too late to be useful. He held up both hands, and even as he was doing it, some part of him noted that this was precisely the gesture a man would make if he were trying to appear harmless while following someone, and he said, or attempted to say, something about simply needing the facilities, which was entirely true, and which sounded, emerging from his mouth in that context, approximately as convincing as he feared it would. Yui's expression, by this point, had moved past displeasure into something more complicated, a tightness around her eyes that suggested she was running through possible explanations and finding most of them unacceptable, and one of her friends said something in that specific low tone that contains an implication without stating it, and Kenji decided that the only reasonable move was to simply not be here anymore. He turned around and walked back toward the main path with considerable speed and very little ceremony. His friends, who had been watching from a comfortable distance and were in significant distress from the effort of maintaining straight faces, fell into step beside him, and the laughter, when it arrived, came the way it does when it has been held too long, quiet at first, and then suddenly not, rolling in waves that bent several of them forward and made walking temporarily inadvisable. Kenji walked with purpose and did not join in, though something in him had loosened very slightly, the way very bad luck sometimes crosses some invisible threshold and becomes its own kind of dark comedy, the universe's sense of humor failing to be funny but at least being legible. He made the case to his friends that they had, probably, seen the essential highlights, that souvenir shopping near the station would be efficient, that an earlier train was achievable if they moved now, and that there was no particular reason to linger in the area. His friends, who understood very well the reasoning that was not being stated, agreed to this proposal with expressions of enormous helpfulness and only a modest amount of mockery, which he appreciated in the way you appreciate things when you don't have much else available. The souvenir shop near the station was the warm, compact, pleasantly overwhelming kind, narrow aisles, a postcards rack near the door, baskets of wrapped sweets in regional varieties, small ceramic pieces on low shelves with hand-lettered signs, and the slow-turning keychain display just inside the entrance that completed a half-rotation every time someone walked past it. Kenji went in with the simple intention of finding something appropriate for a parent or a colleague, paying quickly, and leaving, and he was somewhere in the middle of this process, standing in front of a display of small lacquered chopstick sets, holding two of them up in the mild concentration of a man whose attention is mostly elsewhere, when he became aware of voices from the aisle just on the other side of a low partition to his left. He recognized them before he had consciously identified them, the way you sometimes recognize a sound a fraction of a second before you know what it is. He looked, because he needed to be certain, and yes, Yui's group, moving through the sweets section one aisle over, baskets in hand, absorbed in the quiet deliberation between regional rice crackers and wrapped mochi and the small tins of flavored tea that always photograph well and taste like a polite apology. Yui looked up at the same moment. And this time, perhaps because it was the third time, perhaps because 3 encounters in entirely unconnected locations in the space of a single morning had a cumulative weight that the first and second had not been able to carry alone, or perhaps because one of her friends leaned in at exactly that moment and said something in a very particular tone, this time the reaction was louder and sharper than the ones before it. A word came through the shop that was not a quiet word, and a tone came with it that had the shape of an accusation rather than a question, the kind that is not especially waiting for a response because it believes it has already arrived at one, and it landed in the space between them with enough volume that the other customers nearby looked up briefly from what they were doing. And something in Kenji shifted. He had, in the past 24 hours, apologized more times than he could count. He had backed away and turned around and made himself small and peripheral and sorry in every direction that had presented itself, and all of it had been warranted, and he had understood that, and he had not begrudged a single instance of it. But there was something about this particular accusation, the slight performative quality of it, the way it seemed pitched not only to him but to the general vicinity, as though intended to be overheard by the shelves and the postcards and the slowly spinning keychains, that caught on something in him he had not been expecting to find. He did not, technically, raise his voice. But he spoke, with a clarity and a directness that surprised him somewhat even as the words were arriving, and what he said was, in essence, the simple and obvious argument that the restroom had been the only restroom within walking distance of the shrine complex, that the inn had been where he had stayed, which had not been his choice to make in relation to her, that the souvenir shop near the train station was, as far as he was aware, a public establishment, that he had been trying, at each of these 3 moments, to cause as little disruption as possible and to be somewhere else as quickly as he could manage, and that being characterized as he was being characterized, in the middle of a shop, in front of a rack of slowly turning keychains, was something he found he could not quite absorb without at least noting his disagreement. It was not his most graceful moment, and he was aware of that even while it was happening. His friends had gone very quiet in the particular way people go quiet when they are trying to become furniture. Yui's friends had the look of people who had been expecting one kind of response and received another, and were in the process of recalibrating. And Yui herself stood with an expression that was harder to read than the ones before, still carrying the residue of a long morning of unpleasant coincidences, still guarded, still sharp around the edges, but with something underneath all of that which he could not quite name from where he was standing, and which he would only be able to identify from a much greater distance, from a vantage point he had, at this moment, no reason to anticipate. The moment passed the way moments in busy shops tend to pass, absorbed by the ambient noise, by the other customers returning quietly to their own business, by the continued patient rotation of the keychain display, and Kenji paid for his chopstick set without meeting anyone's eyes, and his friends paid for whatever they were buying, and they filed out through the entrance and back into the afternoon. The walk to the station was quiet, and the train, when it came, was one of those unhurried regional services with wide windows and seats that had been gently reupholstered at some point in the past decade, and Kenji found a place by the window and settled into it with the specific weight of someone who has been through considerably more than they had planned for. The landscape moved past at the train's own pace, low hills first, then broader fields with the pale gold of late harvest at their edges, then the gradual thickening of roads and rooftops that meant they were heading back toward the city, and he watched it with the mild, glazed quality of exhaustion that makes everything outside feel like it is happening at a slight remove. His friends were talking softly in the seats around him, and the events of the morning were already taking on the early shape of a story that would be told many times, the details settling and sharpening as stories do when they are being tried out for the first time, finding the version that will stick. He was not yet ready to find it funny, but he could feel the distance from the morning beginning to open, the slight unwinding that comes when something is no longer happening and has merely happened. And that was something, at least. He rested his head against the cool glass of the window and let his thoughts settle in the gradual way they settle when there is nothing more immediately required of them. He found himself thinking, with a kind of tired objectivity, that he had managed to encounter the same group of women in 3 entirely unrelated locations in the span of a single morning, which was not an achievement he would have aimed for under any circumstances. He thought about the look on Yui's face in the souvenir shop, not the accusation part, but the thing underneath it, the complicated layer he hadn't been able to read, and found that he could not make it resolve into anything definite, and so he let it go. He did not know her name, he remembered. It had not come up in any of their 3 brief and uncomfortable meetings. He knew nothing about her except that she had clear feelings about unexpected guests in her room, and an apparent talent for occupying the same spaces he did even when he was actively working to avoid that outcome. And he could not quite account for this, and would not have tried if asked something about the shape of the day. The way it had kept producing these encounters despite all logic and all effort to the contrary, had a quality to it that he found he could not entirely dismiss, even as he recognized this as probably the kind of thought you have on a train when you are tired and your afternoon has been unusual. The train moved on, and the light did what evening light does in the gentler seasons, began its preparations somewhere out beyond the hills, softening the fields into colors that don't quite have names, muting the edges of things into something quieter than the day had been. Somewhere on this line, or perhaps a different service altogether, Yui was making her own way home, and whatever she was thinking about the events of the morning, and it was reasonable to assume it was not, at this precise moment, generous, she believed, in all likelihood, that the story was finished. A stranger had wandered into her room at an inn and then, through some baffling logic of tourist geography, had appeared in her morning twice more, and she had made clear what she thought of it, and now everyone was going home. That was a sensible thing to believe. And in one sense, she was not wrong. The trip was over. The accumulation of small mortifications and mutual displeasure had reached its final point in a souvenir shop, and the day was folding itself away now into the particular quiet of things that have ended. But stories, as a rule, are not especially attentive to what is sensible to believe, and this one was not finished with either of them, though neither of them would have had any reason to know it from the window of a regional train on a mild Tuesday evening. For tonight, though, it is enough to follow Kenji through those three unhappy collisions, the polished lobby, the gravel path in front of the restroom sign, the shop with its slow-turning keychains, and to sit with him now in the soft rhythm of the train, the fields moving past, the day finally beginning to release its hold. He would not see Yui again for some time after this, and he was, sitting there with his forehead against the cool glass, quite sure he did not mind. And somewhere in the descending quiet of the evening, with the weight of the past 24 hours at last beginning to lift and the train carrying him gently homeward through the soft, grey-gold light, that is where this particular morning rests. And so we leave that hallway behind, its quiet shadows settling into stillness, its story folding gently inward like the last page of a letter. There is no hurry here. If you need a moment, take it now, a slow breath in, and a slower breath out, your body sinking a little deeper into wherever you are resting. The night outside is patient. The dark holds everything softly. Our next story continues from that same still place, the same night unfolding, the same unhurried hours stretching wide and open before us. We are in no rush to arrive anywhere. Simply let the sound of these words carry you forward, as water carries a leaf, without effort, without resistance, drifting on. Some weeks after the incident at the inn, on an ordinary Wednesday evening when a fine mist of rain had been hovering over the city since late afternoon, Kenji walked into a small izakaya near his station and settled himself onto a stool at the counter, because he wanted a cold beer and the evening was long and this seemed like the most reasonable thing to do. Life had resumed its ordinary texture in the weeks since the end, the commutes, the desk work, the lunches eaten too quickly, the evenings that blurred together in the comfortable way of evenings that ask nothing remarkable of you. He had not thought about the inn much, or he had told himself he had not, which amounts, he supposed, to nearly the same thing. So he had no particular reason to be on guard when he pushed through the warm curtain and found himself in the amber glow of the place, the smell of grilled skewers and soy mixing with the low hum of other people's evenings, the shelves of bottles behind the bar each lit softly from below, the quiet sound of the rain outside now reduced to something comfortable and remote. The bartender set a cold glass in front of him without being asked, because Kenji had the look of someone who had earned it, and he wrapped both hands around the glass and let himself exhale for the first time since noon. The counter was maybe 10 seats long, mostly empty at this hour, a pair of older salarymen somewhere near the far end, still in their loosened ties, speaking in the low and unhurried tones of men who have agreed, without discussing it, that they are done with the day and the day does not get to argue. A few empty stools between them and Kenji, a few more on his other side, patient in the amber warmth. He settled into the simple company of his drink and the rain and let his mind go soft and unfocused, the way it does when you have given it permission to stop working for a while. This is what counter seats at an izakaya are for, not the elaborate social performance of a table, but the plain permission to be present without being required to account for yourself, to exist briefly in a warm and amberlit room while the city gets on with its business outside. He ordered a skewer, because the smell had been persuasive since he was still on the street, and watched the condensation make its slow journey down the side of his glass. He was somewhere in the middle of his second drink when he noticed her. 2 seats to his left, there was a woman, and she had clearly been there for some time before Kenji arrived. There was already an empty glass pushed to the side and a fresh one in front of her, and she had the settled, slightly tilted posture of someone who had been working through something, and had been working through it here for a while. She was talking, mostly to the bartender, or to the counter in front of her, or to the general ambient air of the room, the voice of someone who arrived with a grievance fully formed and has found that saying it once has not been entirely sufficient. Kenji caught the rhythm of it before he caught the words, the careful rising emphasis of someone who wants to be sure they have been understood, who has the facts arranged in a particular order and intends to move through them. He did not look over directly, because that is the unspoken courtesy of the counter. You can sit beside a stranger without being with them, and you observe that courtesy especially when the stranger is clearly having a night. But the bar was small enough and quiet enough that the words came to him anyway, in pieces. A man, she was saying, and unbelievable, and immediately, and what on earth could he have been thinking, repeated in the careful way of someone who has not yet found an answer to the question. The bartender provided the appropriate accompaniments, a small sound of sympathy here, a slow nod there, the practiced expression of a professional who has long since learned that some evenings require a human presence on the other side of the counter more than they require anything else. She continued working through it, and Kenji looked at the row of bottles ahead of him and thought that the decent thing was to take up a little less space in the room and let the woman have her privacy, such as the room was able to provide. He was beginning to decide that she seemed more or less fine, that this was simply the kind of evening many people have, and that the world was full of its own business tonight, and none of it was his. And then she shifted slightly on her stool, turning to reach for her glass, and the warm light of the lantern above the counter caught her face. And Kenji felt something specific happen somewhere underneath his ribs, the low, cold, very particular sensation of recognizing someone you had been rather relying on the size of the city to have absorbed. It was her. The woman from the inn, the wrong room, the borrowed yukata, the very long bow in the hallway the next morning, the embarrassment that had taken him the better part of a week to stop replaying at inconvenient moments. She was here, at this izakaya, 2 stools to his left. She had not seen him. The calculation that followed was rapid and not particularly dignified. His wallet was in his jacket, the bartender had his tab, and if he moved now, quietly, while her attention was elsewhere, he could be through the curtain and back into the rain before anything was required of him. He knew the exact amount he owed. He was composing the gesture of leaving, rehearsing the smooth and casual reach for his wallet. And then she said something that made him stop. She told the bartender, in the flat and deliberate way of someone arriving at the center of the thing they have been circling, that it had been her first time. Her first time telling someone she liked them, she meant, and she said it with the care you take when you want the weight of something to be properly received, because it mattered to her very much, and she had never done it before, not in school, not through university, not in all the years that had come and gone in which she had simply stepped around the opportunity every time it appeared, because she was not the sort of person who says things she is not yet ready to say. She had thought about it carefully, she said, almost quietly now. She had prepared it and rehearsed it in private, had talked herself into it and then out of it and then back in again over the course of several weeks. And when she finally said the words she had felt, in that moment, as though something inside her had opened. The man had smiled and said yes, he was pleased, and then, in roughly the same breath, had begun to steer her toward a door, and she had understood what kind of door it was, and before she had quite processed all of this she had already slapped him once, open-handed, and walked away. She did not finish the sentence about the door, because the bartender clearly understood, and so did Kenji, sitting 2 stools to her right, sitting very still. She said the slap had been involuntary, she had not planned it, had not known it was coming, and she was still not entirely certain she regretted it. She said this without theater and without apology, as a plain fact that existed and that she had come to some accommodation with as a fact. The bartender murmured something, the low and gentle murmur of a professional who knows exactly when sympathy is required and when solutions are beside the point. She turned her glass slowly in both hands and said that what bothered her most was not even the hotel suggestion. As bad as the hotel suggestion had been, it was the speed of it, the transparent arithmetic of it, the feeling that her words had been received as nothing more than a preliminary step in a transaction she had not agreed to, as though the courage of the thing had simply made no impression at all. Kenji sat very still and thought about the universe and its questionable sense of arrangement. He had no part in this story, none whatsoever. That was some other man, with worse judgment and different intentions, and Kenji was entirely innocent of this particular offense. And yet sitting there in the warm amber light, he found that he did not feel entirely innocent. He felt, in some way he could not clearly articulate, implicated by the accumulated absurdity of the checkpoint the next morning and the tourist site and the souvenir shop, by the simple fact of being the wrong man in the wrong place at too many of the same moments, and of her having had to encounter him so repeatedly when she had done nothing to deserve any of it. He thought about the bow in the hallway, the careful and very long bow, the floor tiles he had studied during it. He thought about how she had looked at him at checkout, the look of someone who has had quite enough of a particular person for a particular trip. He was still occupied with this, still working out whether it would be kinder to leave before she noticed or whether being caught in the act of leaving would somehow be worse, when she looked up. She looked directly at him, with the slightly narrowed attention of someone whose vision has been softened by drink but whose recognition is still perfectly functional, and he watched the moment of recall move across her face, the noticing, then the placing, then the long still pause of someone whose memory has just delivered a result that requires a moment to process. For several seconds, neither of them moved. He had the impression they were both rapidly reviewing the same sequence of events and arriving at the same conclusion, which was that they were in a situation for which neither of them had a prepared response and no obvious protocol existed. She pointed at him, not in accusation, more in the way you point at something when you need your hand to help your brain make sense of what it is seeing, and made a sound that was mostly vowels. He raised one hand in a small, careful wave, the wave of a man trying to communicate simultaneously that he is harmless, that this is a coincidence, and that he fully supports whatever decision she makes about how the next few moments should proceed. She stared at him. He held the wave a moment longer than was probably necessary, then set his hand back on the counter. What happened next he would not be able to reconstruct precisely. Even later, it proceeded less like a logical sequence of decisions and more like the way water finds its way around an obstacle, quietly and without announcing its intention. Somehow she moved her glass one seat closer, not all the way, just one seat, but one seat was enough, close enough to signal that she was willing to be in the conversation even if she had not yet decided what kind of conversation it was or what she thought of the person she was having it with. He ordered her another drink because it seemed like the right thing to do, and she accepted it, and the bartender set it down with the smooth efficiency of a professional who has long since stopped being surprised by how evenings develop. For a while they talked around the edges of things, where he worked, that he had come in out of the rain, that the skewers here were better than they looked, and she offered small things in return, listening and observing, testing the temperature of the room. She did not mention the inn, and neither did he, and this felt like a grace they were each quietly extending to the other, a mutual and unspoken act of mercy that required no acknowledgement. And then, after a while, she returned to the story of the confession. Not abruptly and not all at once, but the way you return to something when the room has grown quiet enough and the person across from you seems steady enough and you have been carrying the thing alone for long enough that the weight of it has started to feel heavier than the discomfort of sharing it. She told him that the man had not been a stranger, she had known him somewhat, enough to have decided she liked him, enough to have worked herself, over the course of weeks, into the position of saying so. She told him, with the slightly mortified honesty of someone confessing the confession itself, that she had rehearsed the words so many times in private that by the time she said them aloud they had felt simultaneously enormous and very small, the way things do when they have been held for a long time and are finally released. She said she had expected him to be kind. Just that, she said, not elaborate, not dramatic, just kind, the ordinary human decency of someone receiving something that has cost another person something to give. Kenji listened and did not offer anything except his attention, because he could tell that advice was not what was needed tonight, and that sympathy in words would be the wrong kind. What was needed was simply someone sitting close enough to the story to take it seriously, and that, at least, he could provide. She said that what she found hardest to set aside, when she let herself examine it, was the feeling of having done something brave and having it treated as a formality, as though the courage of it had been entirely invisible, as though all that mattered was the yes at the end of it and what the yes might be exchanged for. He said, after a pause, That seemed like a reasonable thing to find difficult to forgive. She looked at him, and this time the look was a little softer than the earlier ones, still cautious, but something in it had eased slightly, the way a room eases when the rain has been going long enough outside that you stop expecting it to stop. She said he seemed like a calm sort of person, and he said he had had a somewhat unusual month, and something in her face moved in the direction of a smile, small and uncertain, and he looked back at his drink because he did not want to make a thing of it. The salarymen at the far end had gathered their things and left at some point in the last half hour, and the bar was quieter now, just the two of them and the bartender, and the rain making its steady, unhurried sound against the glass, and the amber warmth of the lanterns doing what lanterns are supposed to do. They talked for a while longer, and at some point the conversation moved away from the man and the confession and toward smaller and less weighted things, the ordinary background material of two people who are cautiously becoming less like strangers and more like something else, though neither of them had named what the something else was. She did not apologize for the ranting, and he did not mention that he had overheard it, and this too was a kind of generosity they were each quietly offering the other, a small mutual kindness that required no receipt. When she finally stood to leave and reached for her coat, a light one, not quite suited to the rain outside, she paused to button it, and she said that it had been strange to run into him here, of all places. He said yes. He agreed with that. Strange was exactly the word. She said, take care of yourself, the way you say it to someone when you have not yet decided what to call them, not a friend, not quite, not a stranger anymore, something in the uncertain middle space between those two things that does not have a convenient name in any language. He said the same, and she left, and the curtain fell behind her, and for a moment the sound of the rain came in and then settled back out again as the fabric came to rest. He sat with what remained of his drink and the comfortable amber silence of the counter, and he thought. He thought about her first confession, the long private preparation of it, the weeks of deliberation, the moment of finally saying the words, and then the swift and careless way those words had been received, as though they were a door handle rather than a gift. He thought about courage, and how it tends to exist in forms that no one else will ever see, in the private rehearsals, in the quiet decisions, in the moment when you finally say the thing you have been afraid to say, with no guarantee that the world on the other side of that moment will receive it with any of the care it deserves. He thought about the slap, and the calm, matter-of-fact way she had described it, not proud, not ashamed, just certain, the quiet certainty of someone who had known exactly where the line was and had simply responded when it was crossed, and he found that this told him something about her that he thought was worth knowing. He finished his drink slowly and left a careful amount on the counter and nodded to the bartender, who nodded back in the quiet way of someone who has watched the whole evening without comment and intends to keep it that way. Outside, the rain had gentled again, the way it does when you have been inside long enough that it has had time to reconsider its intentions, and the street was dark and quiet, faintly warm with the reflections of the shop lights in the wet pavement. He walked back to the station with his hands in his pockets and thought about the city and how it is full of people moving through it in the evenings carrying things they have not said to anyone yet, and how sometimes two of those people end up on adjacent stools in a small warm place and the carrying gets a little lighter for an hour, and how this is not nothing, even when you cannot say what it amounts to. He boarded his train and found a seat near the window, and the city moved past him station by station, each platform briefly lit and then gone, and he sat with the mild and slightly surprised feeling of someone who has had an evening that went completely differently than expected and has found that this is, rather unexpectedly, not an unpleasant feeling to have. When he arrived home and hung up his jacket and heard the rain against his own window, quieter here, more private than the izakaya's rain had been, he found himself holding something he could not quite name, some low and unhurried sense that the world is occasionally more arranged than it appears, and that sometimes the things you would most like to have finished with have simply not yet finished deciding what they are. He lay down in the dark, and the room went soft around him the way rooms do when the rain is going steadily outside and the day has fully spent itself, and the evening settled into the deep and wordless quiet that lives just on the other side of everything. And there, for tonight, it rested. And so we leave that hallway behind, its quiet weight settling now like snow settling on still water, slowly, without a sound. There is no hurry here. If you need a moment, let your breath come slowly in through the nose, long and soft, and out again, carrying the last of the day with it. The night is wide and there is nowhere else you need to be. Our next story takes us the same story continuing, the same night unfolding, a little deeper, a little further into the hours when the world outside has finally gone still. Let your shoulders soften. Let your hands rest. We are in no rush at all. Somewhere in a small Tokyo apartment, on a weekday evening not long after the strange night at the izakaya, a man named Kenji sat at his low desk with a phone number written in pencil on the corner of a receipt, and he had been sitting there for longer than he would have liked to admit. He had found the number easily enough. Yui had given it to him that evening at the bar, in that loose, generous way that people sometimes give their numbers when they have been drinking, as though they are handing over a stone from a riverbank rather than something that might actually matter later. And now it mattered, or at least it was supposed to, because somewhere in the haze of that evening he had apparently agreed to introduce her to a man, a suitable and presumably decent man, and he had told her he would call. He sat with the receipt for a while, smoothing one corner of it with his thumb. The lamp on the desk made a small warm circle around his hands, and outside the window the sounds of the street came and went in the way they do in that hour between dinner and proper night, a bicycle going past without urgency, the far sound of a train, someone in the lane below calling a name in a perfectly ordinary voice. The whole city moving along with no particular interest in the mild hesitations of one man at one desk. It was not that he was nervous, exactly, he would later tell himself. It was more that he had spent the better part of several days turning over the memory of that izakaya evening in his mind, the woman 2 seats away talking loudly about a man she had grown to despise. The slow turn of her head when she had noticed him sitting there, and the strange subsequent hours in which he had somehow become a social coordinator for a person whose last name he was not entirely sure he knew. He picked up the phone and dialed. It rang 4 times, and on the 5th ring a voice answered, clear and a little flat in the way voices are when the person on the other end does not recognize the number and has not yet decided whether they want to. Kenji said his name, said they had met a few nights ago at a bar near the station, and explained that he was calling about the arrangement they had discussed, about finding someone to introduce her to. There was a silence on the other end of the line. Not the brief, thoughtful kind of silence, but the longer, stranger kind, the kind that belongs to someone who is searching very carefully inside their own memory and not finding what they expected to find there, as though a shelf they were certain held a certain thing turns out, on closer inspection, to hold only dust. And then Yui asked, in a voice that was perfectly polite and entirely genuine, who he was. Not who he was in any larger philosophical sense, but in the most basic sense. His name meant nothing to her. The bar meant nothing, the arrangement meant nothing, and from the careful courtesy of her tone, Kenji himself appeared to mean approximately nothing to her, which was to say he was a voice on a telephone attached to no face she could locate in any room she could remember. He held the phone and let this information settle, and what he was letting settle was this. She had been drunk enough that evening to have given her number to a man she would not remember, agreed to an arrangement she had already forgotten entirely, and was now speaking to him with the polite wariness of someone who has answered a call they are not certain they should have answered. He thought about simply apologizing and hanging up. There was a version of that evening in which that was exactly what he did, in which the whole strange accumulating sequence of encounters ended there, quietly, with a dial tone in a dim apartment and no further complications for anyone. But instead he took a slow breath and told her that this might take a moment to explain, and Yui replied, still with that careful evenness, that she had a moment. And so Kenji began. He started at the beginning, the inn, the trip with friends from work, the long evening of drinking, the point at which he had separated from the group and made his way back toward what he had believed, with the full conviction of a tired and fairly intoxicated man, to be his own room. He explained the corridor, the door that had opened without difficulty in the way doors do when you have the right key, which he had, the futon already laid out, which had seemed to him at the time like perfectly normal service or perhaps even good luck, and the settling in that followed with the deep relief of someone who has found exactly what they needed after a long day. He explained the waking, not the precise manner of it, which he kept in the vaguest and most neutral terms available to him, but simply that there had been a sound, and that he had opened his eyes in a room that turned out, in the alarming clarity that sometimes arrives in such moments, not to be his. He explained the rest of it in the tone of someone reading from a document they would rather not have authored, the yukata, which he mentioned with a brevity that communicated everything while elaborating on nothing, the corridor, the inn staff who had appeared with expressions that could have bent metal, the apology, the particular low and specific misery of bowing very deeply to a stranger at an hour when all he had wanted, from the beginning of the evening, was to be asleep. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Yui spoke very quietly, and what she said was that she was beginning, slowly, to remember a room, she murmured, and a corridor, and, she allowed with some caution, a man. Kenji continued, because there was still more, and having gotten this far he felt it would be stranger to stop than to finish the checkout the following morning, the lobby, the group of women, the looks they had given him, the departure that had taken place at something close to a jog. He mentioned the tourist site and the encounter near the toilets, which he presented in as neutral a tone as he could sustain, since from any outside perspective the timing had been, he acknowledged, spectacularly poor. He mentioned the souvenir shop briefly, the way one mentions the least defensible part of a longer story, letting it pass without elaboration, hoping the pace of the narrative would carry it quietly past. By the time he finished, several minutes had gone by, and the apartment had grown darker in the way apartments do when you have not thought to add more light, and the sounds outside the window had settled into the quieter register of later evening, fewer bicycles, the softer movement of people coming home. And on the other end of the line there was a silence of an entirely different kind from before, not the empty silence of someone who does not recognize a name, but the full silence of someone sitting with a great deal of information they are carefully rearranging, matching it against fragments that had been there in their memory all along, blurred and unexamined, like a photograph kept too long in a drawer and only now unfolded. Then Yui told him that she needed him to come and meet her in person. Not asked, told, in a measured and not unkind tone that was nevertheless not quite optional, the way someone sounds when they have just learned something that requires seeing the person rather than continuing to speak into a telephone. Kenji said he could do that, and they agreed on a day and a place near a station, said their goodbyes, and the line went quiet. He did not know precisely what to expect when the day arrived, but he found himself on the train, running through the whole sequence one more time in his mind: the inn, the corridor, the checkout, the tourist site, the souvenir shop, the izakaya, the way you might review a list before handing it over to someone, just to be sure that none of the facts had rearranged themselves since the last time you checked. They had not, of course. Facts tend not to. It was only that he was about to present them in person to the woman who had been present for all of them and remembered approximately none. The meeting place was on a quiet street not far from a station, and he arrived a few minutes early and stood in the mild afternoon air, watching the ordinary passing of a city that had no particular interest in the mild unease of one person standing on its pavement. When Yui appeared, she came from the direction he had not been watching, and for a moment he simply saw a woman walking toward him before the moment resolved itself into something specific. She was the woman from the inn corridor, and the checkout lobby, and the tourist site near the toilets, and the souvenir shop, and the izakaya 2 nights after that, and also the voice on the telephone from earlier that week, all of these assembled now into one person walking toward him on a perfectly ordinary afternoon, under a perfectly ordinary sky. She stopped when she saw his face. Not dramatically, not with any sound, she simply stopped, the way you stop when something is slightly more unfamiliar than you had accounted for, and she looked at him with an expression that asked, without hostility, what exactly he was doing there. Kenji understood, looking at her, that she still had not entirely connected the pieces, that the voice from the telephone and the face before her were not yet the same person in her memory, that somewhere behind her eyes there were several separate blurry men who had not yet assembled themselves into one man standing on a street in the mild afternoon. He told her his name again, quietly, the way you might hand something to someone who has not yet quite opened their hands. And Yui looked at him for a long moment, and then something shifted in the cast of her expression, not recognition exactly, not the clear snap of it, but the slow beginning of it, the particular rearranging that happens when a memory is arriving from a long way off, unhurried and a little rumpled from the journey. She said his name back to him softly, with the slight questioning rise of someone checking whether a word is the right one. And then she turned and began walking, and he understood from the direction she chose that he was meant to follow her. They went to a family restaurant nearby, the sort of bright and laminated menu place where the tea is reliable and the noise level asks nothing particular of you, where you can sit in a booth and talk without the conversation feeling like an event, and they settled in, and ordered tea, and sat for a moment in the quiet that follows a lot of recent explanation. She looked at him with careful, assessing attention, as though she was still cross-referencing the face before her against the one her memory was slowly producing, and finding that they matched well enough to proceed. She told him then, in the tone of someone making a statement they would like treated as final, that the matter of the man at the izakaya, the confession she had made, the suggestion he had immediately returned with, the slap, the goodbye was not to be mentioned to anyone, under any circumstances, and she said this with a gravity that he received entirely at face value, because her expression did not invite any other interpretation. She added, more softly and with some effort, that it had been, she acknowledged this carefully, the first time she had ever told someone how she felt about them, and that the man in question had responded to this information by immediately proposing a hotel, and that she found this particular sequence of events so profoundly mortifying that she preferred, if possible, to proceed on the understanding that it had technically not occurred. Kenji told her that he understood, and he meant it. She looked at him for a moment with something that was not quite gratitude but was in the same neighborhood, the look of someone who has said a difficult thing and found that the ceiling remained where it was and the table did not crack. Then, as though the necessary formalities had been concluded and they could move on, she turned to the question of the introduction, and Kenji explained what he had been thinking, and Yui listened, and then observed, thoughtfully, that she did not particularly want to meet a single unknown man presented to her without context, that the idea sat uneasily with her in a way she found difficult to specify precisely. Kenji allowed that this was reasonable, and they sat with the tea. And then, in the way that conversations sometimes find their own conclusions before anyone has quite planned for them, they arrived at a different arrangement, not one man introduced to one woman in the specific awkward way of a formal setup, but a gathering, a loose and adequately noisy group of people, some of whom he would bring and some of whom she would bring, and whatever happened in the course of that evening could happen at its own pace and according to its own logic. Yui seemed to find this more acceptable, which was to say she did not object to it, and in the particular register of her manner at that table, not objecting read clearly as a form of yes. They finished their tea, and the restaurant continued its ordinary afternoon around them, and the light through the window shifted slightly as it does when the day is beginning, very gently and without announcement, to lean toward evening. What Kenji would remember most from that afternoon, not immediately, but in the weeks that followed, when he found himself turning it over the way you turn a small smooth thing in your hands, was the moment on the street before they had gone inside, when she had seen his face and stopped, and the slow unhurried process by which she had assembled him from fragments. There had been something quietly absurd about it, about being recognized so gradually, so incrementally, by someone who had in fact encountered him 3 separate times already, and he was aware of the absurdity even as it happened, and aware that she was aware of it, and that they were both choosing, without discussion, not to name it aloud, which felt, in its own small way, like the first thing they had agreed on. The walk back to the station was brief and easy, the kind of walk where the conversation does not need to carry very much weight, and they said the ordinary goodbye things that people say at the end of meetings that have been stranger than expected but have gone, on balance, all right. On the train home, Kenji sat in the moving quiet and looked at his own faint reflection in the window as the city moved past behind it, and he thought about the phone call, the silence that had followed his name, the polite, genuine blankness of someone who had not the faintest idea who was speaking to them, and then the slow, lamp-like warming as the memory had begun to arrive. It had not been, he reflected, the most straightforward chain of introductions, strung as it was across an inn corridor, a checkout lobby, a tourist site, a souvenir shop, a bar stool, a telephone line, and finally a laminated menu booth in a family restaurant, but it had been his, and it had not ended badly, and at the other end of it there was a woman who now knew his name and had chosen, at least for one afternoon, to share a pot of tea with him rather than simply hang up the phone. That, he decided, was something. Outside the train window, the city softened as it moved away from the central wards, rooftops and water towers and the long backs of buildings, going quiet in the slow, untroubled way of things that have been dark many times before and find no particular drama in it. And that is where we leave him tonight, on a train, in the fading light, with something half begun and a name that someone had said back to him quietly and carefully, the way you repeat a word when you are making sure you have heard it right. Some things begin with great certainty and ceremony, visible and decided and announced, and some things begin with a phone call in a dim apartment and a long silence and a patient explanation delivered in 2 installments, one over the telephone and one in a booth with tea going cold, and it is perhaps the second kind that the years are gentler with, the kind you can look back on and find not embarrassment but the small, plain warmth of something real beginning in the only way it knew how. The train moved on, and the city continued around it, and the evening settled in the way it always settles, without asking, without ceremony, simply coming down as it always has. And somewhere out there in the moving dark, a man named Kenji rode home in the ordinary light, not quite knowing what he had started. And so we leave that hallway behind, its shadows settling back into quiet, its voices fading like the last warmth of a candle just blown out. There is no hurry now. If you need a moment, take it, let a slow breath move through you. Let your shoulders fall a little heavier into where you rest. The night is long and patient, and it will hold you here as long as you need. When you are ready, and there is truly no rush, the same story continues, the same night unfolding, gathering itself softly around another voice, another room, another small and tender truth waiting to be told. In the warmth of a Friday evening, Kenji arrived at a small restaurant near the station and stood in the doorway for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the amber lantern light that turned the wooden tables the color of old honey, his coat still holding the cool of the October street. He was early, which was unusual for him, and he spent that small gap of time moving ceramic cups half an inch to the left and then back again, as though the geometry of the table might somehow influence what the evening became. 8 people tonight, 4 men whom he had recruited with the mild good-natured pressure of someone who does not especially enjoy making these calls but makes them anyway, and 4 women that a woman named Yui was gathering somewhere in the city and would bring through that door in. He checked his watch, approximately 15 minutes. The whole arrangement had come about in such a sideways fashion that he still couldn't quite reconstruct the logic of it, tracing it back only as far as a bar, a phone call that had not quite been a phone call, a family restaurant, and an argument about whether introducing strangers to other strangers counted as a favor or merely a different kind of imposition. The conclusion, somehow, had been this: he would gather men, she would gather women, and they would all meet here, and the evening would sort itself into whatever shape evenings of this kind are supposed to take, without anyone being required to explain the sequence of events that had produced the occasion. His friends arrived in the way friends arrive to these things, cheerful, slightly inattentive, already deciding what to order, and the table filled with the easy noise of men who know each other well enough not to be careful. And then the door opened again, and Yui's group came in from the street, 4 women in a loose cluster, mid-conversation, trailing laughter from something that had been said on the pavement outside, and Kenji spotted Yui near the back of the group, a little quieter than the rest, and she spotted him at the same moment. She gave him the look of someone who has agreed to a thing and is now, standing in front of it, taking its full measure, neither happy nor unhappy, only present, assessing, doing the private arithmetic that her expression always suggested was going on behind whatever her face showed. The table arranged itself in the usual fashion, some negotiating of seats, someone suggesting they mix, someone else deferring pleasantly, and eventually everyone settling roughly where they would have settled on instinct, the gentle entropy of social arrangements finding its own level. The conversation started the way it always starts at these gatherings: names, neighborhoods, what everyone did for work, the small polite building blocks of new acquaintance laid out one by one, like cards in a game everyone knows even if no one has explained the rules. A man named Haruto had strong opinions about ramen broth, which helped enormously, because ramen opinions are one of the great social equalizers, capable of pulling almost any stranger into the warm current of an argument they didn't know they needed to have, and the table found its rhythm around this without much effort. The restaurant filled with the pleasant low noise of 8 people becoming gradually less careful with each other, and for a while Kenji let the evening do what it was doing, watching it settle and grow from his end of the table. Pause. And then he glanced at Yui and noticed, with a mild start, that she was almost entirely still. Not unhappy, not conspicuously uncomfortable, she was watching the conversation with a kind of attentive quiet, her hands folded around her small ceramic cup, her posture the posture of someone who is present in the room without quite being inside it, watching the current move past without stepping in. She said almost nothing, and when she did it was brief, a short confirmation of something just said, a small nod and a quiet agreement that dissolved immediately back into the general conversation and left no particular trace. Kenji looked at the others, they were managing perfectly well, the table finding its own momentum, no one looking to Yui in particular, the evening proceeding with or without her in its easy and unremarkable way. And then he thought about the woman who had called him twice a week with her methodical questions, who had spoken to him with the loose, unguarded ease of someone who has known a person for years, whose voice on the phone had been entirely without shyness, and he tried to find that woman in the still and silent one sitting across the table, and found her only barely, in the set of the shoulders, in the careful way the eyes moved. Breath. She had seemed, on the phone, like someone who simply needed the right information before proceeding, capable, direct, only waiting for data she hadn't yet been given, treating him as an accessible reference on a topic she was researching with genuine diligence. And here, across from several men she didn't know, she seemed like a different version of herself entirely, the same person, clearly, but a version that had retreated to a considerable distance from the phone call one, and the gap between the two was interesting enough to sit with for a moment. In the reshuffling that happens naturally as a dinner progresses, someone moving to fill a glass, someone else turning to a new conversation, Kenji found himself, without having quite planned to, drifting to the end of the table where Yui was sitting. Pause. He took the seat beside her with the uncomplicated ease of someone simply finding a convenient chair, and for a moment neither of them said anything, both of them watching the same stretch of table where the ramen conversation had moved into the question of regional variations, which Haruto had opinions about as well. Then Kenji asked her, quietly, how the evening was going, and she turned toward him with the small visible ease of someone who has been sitting in a language they don't quite understand and has just heard, across the room, a word they recognize. She told him it was fine, that everyone seemed very kind, and her voice was composed and pleasant, the voice of someone who has prepared a reasonable answer to a reasonable question and is delivering it as intended. He looked at her. She looked at the table. He asked, gently, whether she was always like this at these kinds of evenings, quieter, he meant, than the person she seemed to be in other circumstances, not accusing, only genuinely curious in the way you are curious about a thing that doesn't match the shape you expected. She considered the question with a seriousness that suggested it deserved more consideration than it might appear to warrant, and then admitted that men she didn't know were, in some way she found difficult to articulate, simply hard to talk to, not threatening, not unpleasant, just hard in the way a thing becomes hard when you haven't had much practice with it, and she had not had very much practice. Pause. He nodded at this, because it seemed to him like a reasonable thing to feel, and he was not inclined to argue with a reasonable thing when he found one, only to sit beside it for a while. Then he asked, with the lightness of someone who is genuinely asking and not making a point, whether he was in that same category, whether talking to him required the same kind of effort as the others, whether sitting here beside him was the same kind of difficulty. She looked at him for a moment, and the expression that crossed her face was complicated in a way that took a moment to resolve itself, and then she told him, plainly and without ceremony, that he was fine. That she was fine with him. Pause. He waited, because something in the way she said it left a space that wanted filling, and she filled it. She told him, carefully, that it was because she knew him in some sense, that there was a familiarity between them, however that familiarity had come about. She did not say the word inn, or the word corridor, or the word futon. She didn't need to, because both of them were in perfect agreement about which morning she was referring to, and neither of them required the details to be restated. Kenji turned this over quietly, sitting there beside her while the table continued its good noise around them, trying to map the shape of what she was saying, that the worst morning of his recent life, the morning of the wrong room and the unlucky timing and the expressions on everyone's faces, including the very patient and very unhappy in staff, had produced in Yui's private accounting of the world something that functioned, improbably, as a credential. Not a credential of character, exactly, not a commendation, only the fact of having been in a humiliating situation with her and having survived it without making it worse, of having apologized and left and not compounded the thing, and of having appeared again afterward in unlikely circumstances without design or intention, and of having then answered her phone calls. Breath. The logic was upside down in the way only the best logic is, where the thing that should have made everything worse had instead made something else, quietly, and without anyone authorizing it, and you couldn't argue with it because arguing would require dismantling the outcome, and the outcome was two people sitting beside each other in a warm restaurant on a Friday evening, talking without difficulty. He found himself thinking that there were probably people who arrived at ease with each other through sensible means, through coffee, through mutual friends, through the slow reasonable accumulation of small shared experiences, and then there were people whose ease arrived backwards, through a hotel corridor at midnight and a scream in the dark and an apology so deep the floorboards had seemed involved, and both routes, he supposed, led eventually to the same place. He almost said this to her, and then decided against it, because it was the kind of observation that sounds wry inside someone's head and merely peculiar when spoken aloud, and because the evening didn't call for peculiar observations so much as for something more practical. Pause. He asked her instead, in the mild useful way of someone who has decided to be helpful, whether she thought she might try saying something to the others, nothing elaborate, only a comment, the conversational equivalent of testing the water before committing to it. She looked at the group with an expression that was not quite reluctance and not quite willingness but something honest and quiet between them, and then she looked at him, and the look said something she didn't put into words, something in the neighborhood of, "I know you're right about this, and I am not certain I can do it, but I am listening." He told her that Haruto was not a frightening man, that he was, if anything, someone who simply needed an audience and would receive any comment with disproportionate warmth, and that ramen was almost certainly the safest possible subject from which to attempt an entry. She listened to this with the careful attention of someone receiving field notes before a mission they hadn't asked to go on, and then, in the next natural pause in the conversation at the far end of the table, she said something he didn't quite catch what, only the word ramen and the small deliberate way she aimed it, and the quietness of the delivery, which was the quietness of someone doing a thing carefully rather than easily. What happened next was small and ordinary and entirely real. Haruto turned toward her with the open enthusiasm of someone who has been given permission to expand on a topic he already wanted to expand on, and the table shifted almost imperceptibly, the way a room shifts when a space in it has been quietly filled. Long pause. And Yui's posture changed, not dramatically, not in any way someone across the room would have noticed, but something in the shoulders loosened by a single degree, the way a window latch eases when the frame stops pressing against it, and she settled, just slightly, into the conversation she had started. Kenji watched this from his end of the table and felt something that was not quite pride. He had not done anything that warranted pride, had only suggested a thing and allowed her to do it herself, which is different and warmer than satisfaction, a feeling that didn't have a name he could find immediately, only a shape, which was something like, good. The evening went on around them in the way good evenings go. The food arrived in small ceramic dishes and was divided with the mild pleasant ceremony of shared meals. Someone ordered another round, and the conversation found its own current and carried everyone forward without effort. Breath. Yui spoke more as the hours moved, not easily or fluently, but in the way someone practices a thing they are genuinely not practiced at carefully, with long deliberate gaps, choosing her words with the quiet seriousness of someone who means them, and this quality of attention, it turned out, was something the others noticed without knowing they were noticing it. From time to time, in the longer stretches of conversation, she would turn briefly back toward him, not obviously, not in a way that drew anyone else's attention, only a small shift, a look that said something in the direction of, I am still finding my way in this current, and it is easier knowing you are at the same table. He would answer these looks with a small nod, the kind that costs nothing and says, yes, I see, carry on. You are doing fine, the particular wordless shorthand that people develop when they have somehow become each other's context in a room, the kind of language that requires no prior arrangement. Later, walking home through the city in the specific quiet of a Friday evening that has given up most of its noise but not yet all of it, Kenji moved through the orange-lit streets with the warmth of the restaurant still somewhere in his coat, his footsteps the only footsteps for most of the walk. The pavement was wet from rain that had come and gone while they were inside, and the streetlights made long soft shapes on the dark surface of it, and he let the walk take the time it wanted to take, without hurrying it. He thought about trust, about how it forms, about the unlikely materials it sometimes selects when it is building itself, and found that he did not have a theory so much as a single observation, which was that the materials Yui had used seemed, when he looked at them plainly, no more improbable than anyone else's. Pause. She had seen a man who had done something embarrassing by accident and apologized without making it larger, who had reappeared in unlikely places without intention or design, who had answered her phone calls and her questions without complaint, who had organized an evening he had not asked to organize and shown up early and moved the chairs more carefully than the chairs required. This was not, he supposed, an implausible foundation for something, if a person was inclined to build on it. He was not sure, standing at the intersection waiting for the light to change, what to call what he was thinking about. It was not a conclusion, not a decision, not even quite a feeling he could hold steady enough to examine, more like a loose thread he was aware of without yet knowing what it connected to on the other end. The light changed, and he crossed, and his feet carried him the rest of the way home with the comfortable automatic authority of feet that know a route and require nothing further from the mind. Breath. He thought of Yui turning toward the group, that small, deliberate turn. The word ramen dropped into the conversation like a stone into still water, and the way the evening's surface had moved outward from it in quiet rings. He thought of her saying, simply and without any performance, that he was fine, that he was familiar, in the same tone you might use for a coat that fits well or a route that turns out to be shorter than you remembered, practical, unglamorous, and in its way entirely sincere. Pause. He found, when he considered it on the walk home through the orange-lit streets, that he had no particular objection to being described as familiar, to being, for someone, the person who could be sat next to in a difficult room without needing to explain himself, without needing to construct a version of himself that was easier to approach. There was something in that description that was, despite its modesty, a kind of gift, not the kind you would have aimed for, not the one you would have chosen if you'd been given options, but the kind that arrives from an improbable direction and turns out, when you hold it up and look at it, to be exactly the right shape. He knew she would probably call that week more questions, more careful inquiries about the workings of men, more of the methodical research that had become, over the past several weeks, its own quietly anticipated rhythm, its own small standing appointment in the structure of his evenings. Pause. And he knew, walking through the last stretch of the street before home, that he would answer when she called, and pick up the question wherever she left it, and sit with it for however long it needed, because this was, without his having quite decided it, simply what he now did. The station came into view, and he slowed slightly, the way you slow when you are not quite ready to stop thinking about something, when the thinking itself is still doing something useful inside you, still moving something quietly into place. He went through the gate, and the train came after a few minutes, and he sat by the window in the comfortable way of someone who does not need to look at anything in particular, only needs something to rest the eyes upon while the day settles into whatever shape it is finally going to take. Breath. Outside, the city moved past in its evening configuration, lit windows, the dark gaps between buildings, the occasional platform with its small cluster of people waiting, each of them with their own Friday carrying them somewhere in the quiet October night. He let his thoughts slow, the way thoughts slow when you have stopped asking them to be useful, when you are simply a person on a train, watching the city thin into the neighborhoods that come after the city, the lights spreading further apart, the dark between them growing easier. And the shape the day seemed to be taking, as the train moved and the stations came and went and the city gave way to the gentler dark beyond it, was the shape of something that had gone, in its quiet sideways way, rather better than he had expected. Not the evening he had imagined, the gathering had not produced the tidy outcomes it had nominally been organized to produce, had not sorted itself into matched pairs and clean conclusions, but something he found he was more inclined to think about than the evening he had imagined would have been, something with more texture to it, more to return to. Pause. And that, perhaps, was enough for tonight, the amber warmth of the restaurant still somewhere behind the eyes, the sound of the rails a steady quiet rhythm, and two people who had come to the same table from very different directions finding, without planning it, that sitting next to each other required no explanation from either of them. Outside the window the night was the kind of night that holds you gently, without asking anything of you in return, and the train moved through it softly, and the carriage was warm, and the city was done with its work for the evening, and the dark beyond the glass was the particular generous dark of a place that has decided to let everyone rest. And so we leave that hallway behind, its shadows settling back into stillness, its story folding quietly into the dark. There is no hurry now. If you need a moment, take it, let your breath slow, let your shoulders ease down, let the weight of the day grow a little heavier, a little more distant. The same night is still unfolding around us, the same soft hours stretching on, and our next story waits without impatience, already beginning to breathe at the edges of the quiet. So rest here a little longer if you need to. The night is unhurried. And when you are ready, or perhaps even before you are, we will continue. In his small apartment on a Wednesday evening, a week or so after the group dinner, Kenji was sitting at his low table with a cup of tea going slowly cold when his phone lit up with Yui's name, and he looked at it for a moment, not quite certain what to expect. She had called once already since the evening they had all gone out together, a brief, slightly formal call about something involving a train time, but this felt different, more deliberate, and when he answered, her voice came through carefully, as though she had rehearsed the opening. She said she had a question, and she hoped it wasn't strange to ask, and she wanted to know what it meant when a man she had met at the dinner had messaged her saying he'd had a wonderful time and hoped they might talk again sometime. Kenji set down his tea and thought about it, because there was no reason not to take the question seriously, and he told her that it probably meant exactly what it said, that the man had enjoyed meeting her and would genuinely like to hear from her again. There was a pause on the line, and then Yui said she had thought it might mean something more loaded, something pressured or indirect that she wasn't quite equipped to read, and she had wanted to make sure she wasn't missing something she should know. Kenji said she wasn't missing anything, and she said oh, just oh, the single syllable landing quietly in the space between them, like a small weight setting down. Pause. That was the first call. The second came 2 days later, in the evening again, and the third the following afternoon while Kenji was at his desk eating lunch, and by the end of the second week there were calls most days, sometimes 2 in a single evening, each one beginning in that same careful, slightly formal way. She had a question. She hoped it wasn't strange, and then the question itself, always precise, always earnest. She wanted to know what it meant when a man said he was busy but offered an alternative day. Was that genuine interest, or politeness, or a kind of performance of consideration that didn't mean anything in particular. She wanted to know why men sometimes went quiet after a stretch of frequent messages, and whether that silence meant something had shifted or whether it was simply how men were, whether it was, as she put it with characteristic precision, a feature rather than a fault. She wanted to know whether it was better to message first or to wait, and Kenji told her honestly that there was no rule, that the only thing that truly mattered was what she wanted to do, and she considered this for a moment and then said she supposed she would message first, then. What struck him, during those first weeks, was how genuinely she didn't know, not in the way some people perform not knowing as a kind of softening technique, but in the way of someone who had simply never had access to a particular kind of information, the way you might not know the streets of a city you had never visited, no matter how otherwise capable you were. She had gone from her middle school years directly into a girls' high school, the kind with a long train commute and a strict uniform and a student body that was, from the first day to the graduation ceremony, entirely female, a world complete in itself, with its own social grammar and its own weather, and no reason to look beyond it. And from there she had gone to a women's university, which had continued the pattern without interruption, and the result was that by the time she was 23 she had spent nearly a decade in an arrangement where men appeared mostly at a distance, on platforms, in shops, on the far side of a restaurant, but never quite close enough to be understood as individuals rather than as a general category. They were, Kenji came slowly to understand, another country entirely, a country she had never had occasion to enter, and she was now standing at its border with a phrasebook full of entries she couldn't parse, and she was asking him to translate. Breath. He found he didn't mind. In fact, he noticed this about himself gradually, the way you notice a new habit only after it has already formed without your intending it. He found that he looked forward to the calls. His evenings before had been companionable enough in their own way, the small and reliable rituals of a man living alone, the pleasure of cooking a simple meal for one, the news at whatever volume he chose, the steady unremarkable comfort of his own company, which was not unhappy, only quiet. But when the phone lit up with Yui's name, something in him that had been sitting quietly at rest would shift slightly, the way a lamp in a window seems to glow a little warmer when the street outside goes dark. He would make fresh tea sometimes before answering, which was not something he had done before, and he would settle into his chair properly and listen to whatever question she had been turning over, and then he would tell her what he thought, as honestly and straightforwardly as he could. Pause. She told him once, toward the end of the third week, that he was the only man she felt she could ask these things, and she said it matter-of-factly, not as a compliment but as a simple statement of fact, the way you might mention that a particular hardware shop was the only one within walking distance that stocked a certain size of screw. He asked her why that was, genuinely curious, and she thought about it. He could hear the silence of her thinking, the faint ambient sounds of wherever she was sitting, something that might have been rain against a window, and then she said it was because he already knew the worst of her. He laughed softly at that, and she said she was serious, that he had seen her at the bar in the state she had been in, and he hadn't used it against her in any way, and somehow that had made him trustworthy in a way she didn't entirely understand but wasn't inclined to interrogate. He thought about the bar, the smell of it, the warm amber light of it, the way she had been sitting at the counter with a kind of blurry and dignified indignation about a man who had confused being kind with being a transaction, and how she had startled when she recognized his face, of all possible faces, and how somehow they had talked for an hour, and this had apparently counted as knowing the worst of her, and in her accounting it had been sufficient. He told her, gently, that there was nothing particularly to trust him about, that he was only answering questions. She said that was the point. Pause. The questions were not always about the man from the dinner. Some of them were general and structural, the kind of questions that couldn't have a single answer but that she asked anyway with quiet seriousness, wanting to understand something foundational about how men moved through the world, as though there were underlying principles she could learn if only she found the right person to explain them. She asked what men meant when they said they were fine, whether fine meant what it appeared to mean or whether it carried a subtext she was supposed to be reading. She asked whether men found it unusual when a woman initiated contact, and he told her honestly that most men found it more than fine, and she said she had thought that might be true but hadn't been confident enough in the thought to act on it. She asked whether men talked to each other the way women talk to each other, whether the conversations were similar in their texture, their length, their content, and Kenji paused, genuinely uncertain, and then said probably not in exactly the same way, and she nodded, which he couldn't see but could somehow hear. There was no agenda in any of her questions, no subtext he could detect, only an open and somewhat solemn curiosity, the quality of attention you give to something you have decided to take seriously rather than pretend to already understand. He found it disarming in a way he didn't quite have words for, because most people, in his experience, preferred to appear as though they knew things, to manage the appearance of knowledge even in the absence of it, and she simply asked. Breath. There was an evening somewhere in the 4th week when the call lasted 2 hours, and he didn't notice until he glanced at the clock and found that what had felt like 40 minutes had become 2 hours and 17 minutes, and by then the city outside had quieted and the lamp on his table was the only warm thing in the room. They had started with a question she had answered in under 2 minutes, and then somehow the conversation had wandered, the way conversations do when two people are at ease and neither is watching the time. She told him about her university, the particular strangeness of leaving it, not bad strange, but the strangeness of a world that had been complete in itself, with its own logic and its own warmth, and then stepping out of it into a different world with different rules and no one to ask about them. She said she sometimes felt as though she had learned a great deal about how to move through a world of women and almost nothing about how to move through the world in general, and she had thought she was fine with that, and then apparently she wasn't, and so here she was. Pause. Kenji said he thought most people had some version of that, some part of the world they had never been given a map for, that they had simply managed around without quite acknowledging it. She considered this seriously and said she supposed that was probably true, and then she said, after a moment, that she hadn't expected him to be easy to talk to. He asked why not, and she reminded him of the circumstances of their acquaintance, all of them, the inn room in the dark, the hallway, the tourist spot, the gift shop, the bar, with a dry and patient thoroughness that made him laugh out loud, the genuine kind, the kind you don't prepare for. She said she had concluded from the available evidence that he was either a person of questionable habits or catastrophically unlucky, and she had needed several additional data points before she had been willing to revise her initial assessment. He told her he appreciated her scientific approach, and she said she was glad someone did. Pause. It was around this point in the evening, somewhere after 10, with the lamp still going and the tea long forgotten and gone cold, that Kenji noticed something. It was a quiet thing, the kind of realization that arrives without fanfare, that simply becomes visible if you are paying a particular quality of attention, and he was, for some reason, paying it. He noticed that he had stopped thinking of these calls as something he was doing as a favor, that accounting had been accurate at first, had felt like a complete and reasonable description. She needed information he happened to have, and it cost him nothing to share it, and so he shared it. But somewhere between the first week and the fourth, that description had quietly ceased to be true, or at least had ceased to be sufficient, and he had not marked the moment of the change, had not been present for it, had simply arrived one evening at a different relationship to the ringing phone. Long pause. He picked it up now because it was Yui calling, and that meant a question he would think about carefully and answer honestly, and it meant her voice with its particular combination of gravity and dry humor, and it meant an evening that felt slightly more inhabited than evenings usually did, and all of that was something he had come to value for reasons that had nothing to do with being useful. He didn't say any of this during the 2-hour call. It was too new a realization, still soft at the edges, and he was the kind of person who preferred to sit with a thought for a while before doing anything about it, who distrusted his first instincts enough to give them time to prove themselves. And so the conversation continued until she said she should sleep, and he agreed, and they said good night in the slightly formal way they had both maintained, like a small ritual neither had proposed but both had kept. After the call ended, he sat for a while in the quiet of his apartment, the phone still warm in his hand, the lamp making its circle of light on the table where the cold tea was. Breath. There was a week, somewhere in the 5th week, when the calls came every evening without exception, and each one found him already at his table with fresh tea made, which was a thing he had not planned and did not particularly examine. She asked whether men found it strange when a woman said exactly what she was thinking rather than hinting at it, and he said no, that most men found it a relief, and she said she had always suspected the world might be simpler than people made it seem. She asked whether it was possible to genuinely not know how you felt about something, or whether not knowing was always a form of knowing but not admitting, and Kenji thought about this for longer than usual and then said he thought both were possible and that only time tended to clarify which one you were in. She was quiet for a moment after that, and then she said that was an honest answer, and she seemed satisfied. Pause. The questions were becoming, very gradually, less anxious and more curious. At first they had all carried a small undertone of worry. She had wanted to make sure she hadn't misread something, hadn't made a mistake she couldn't see, hadn't done something that would reveal a gap in her understanding and embarrass her, and this had made them feel a little like tests she was trying not to fail. But as the weeks moved along, that worry dissolved slowly, the way fog dissolves in the morning when the sun comes up, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, until one day you notice it is simply gone. What was left was something lighter and more open, the kind of curiosity that doesn't require a particular outcome, that is content just to understand a thing without needing to do anything specific with the understanding. He noticed that shift too, the way he seemed to be noticing everything about those evenings with a finer attention than he usually brought to his own life, a quality of presence that the days themselves had not quite earned but that the calls had somehow summoned. Pause. There was a Thursday when she didn't call, and he noticed the absence the way you notice a sound stopping, not with alarm, not with anything dramatic, only a small awareness of difference, the way a room feels slightly altered when something that had been providing a quiet ambient noise falls silent. He went about his evening and ate his dinner and read for a while, and the phone stayed dark, and at some point late in the night he understood, with quiet clarity, that he had been waiting for it. She called the following evening with a question about something perfectly ordinary, and he answered it as he always did, and the conversation found its own shape and lasted longer than the question required, and when it ended he sat in the quiet of his apartment and thought about how it was that a person arrived somewhere they hadn't been aiming for, simply by answering the phone enough times. Breath. He thought about the inn, the wrong room in the dark, the borrowed futon and the cold floor and the long embarrassing chain of events that had followed the flight from back entrances, the gift shop, the bar with its amber light and a woman in a state of indignant grief about a man who had mistaken her kindness for an invitation. He had not thought, at any point in that sequence, that it was going anywhere worth going. He had thought, mostly, about how to leave a room without being noticed. But here he was, in his small apartment with the lamp on and the city outside gone soft and still, and somewhere across that city was someone who had his number and would use it tomorrow with a question she genuinely wanted answered, not a performance, not a strategy, just a real question from someone who had decided, on the basis of some evidence he still found slightly surprising, that he was the right person to ask. Pause. He found, sitting with that it was more than he had been expecting from a sequence of events that had begun with the wrong room number, and considerably more than he had any obvious right to after the first impression he had made. And something in him, quiet, unannounced, the part of him that didn't usually make itself known was, he found, content. He made another cup of tea, and this time he drank it while it was still warm, and the night outside continued in its unhurried way, the city settling deeper into its late quiet, the lamp casting its steady amber circle on the table. And that was, for tonight, enough. A man in a small apartment, the phone on the table, tomorrow's question still unasked and unhurried, waiting patiently for whatever the morning would become. And so we leave that hallway behind, its quiet settling into the distance like the last note of a song you almost remember. There is no hurry here. If you need a moment, take it, breathe in slowly, let your shoulders drop a little further into the warmth beneath you. The night is still generous with its hours, and we are in no rush to spend them. Our next story is the same story continuing, the same night unfolding, new and unhurried, waiting for you just as gently as the one before. Rest a breath. Rest too. Whenever you are ready, we will drift forward together. In a small neighborhood park not far from the station, on a mild autumn evening when the ginkgo trees had only just begun to think about turning gold, Kenji sat on a low wooden bench and waited for Yui to arrive. She had sent him a message that afternoon, not long, not elaborate, nothing in it that explained itself, asking him to come and meet her, naming the park, naming the time, and there had been something in the plainness of it that made him say yes without asking why. He had grown used to her, by this point, the strange domestic rhythm of her messages, the way she arrived at his number usually somewhere after 9 in the evening with some version of the same request. Explain this to me, she would say, what does it mean when a man does this? And he would tell her as honestly as he could, which sometimes meant saying things she found annoying. It had been months of this, now of her voice on the other end of the line asking questions with the careful precision of someone taking notes, and him on his end giving answers and then forgetting, usually by morning, that the conversation had happened at all. Walking to the park, He had tried to guess what this evening's question might be, but nothing particular had presented itself, and so he had given up and simply walked, hands loose at his sides, noticing the way the evening smelled of cooling concrete and somewhere nearby someone cooking something with sesame oil, and the particular pleasure of an autumn night that doesn't ask anything of you. The park was modest, a few benches set along a gravel path, the ginkgo trees in a loose row, their leaves catching the last pale light so that they seemed almost to hold it, glowing faintly yellow against the sky that was doing its slow business of darkening. Kenji sat and looked at them for a while, doing the pleasant nothing that benches are good for, the gentle emptiness of waiting when you are not worried about what you are waiting for. There was a bicycle bell somewhere not far beyond the park gate, and a child's voice briefly raised in some distant game, and then quiet again, and the leaves moved in a small wind that came from nowhere and returned there, and none of it was remarkable and all of it was fine. The lamppost along the path flickered on almost without his noticing, casting a circle of warm gold on the gravel, and he sat inside that circle in the early dark and watched the leaves. He heard her footsteps on the gravel before he saw her, that quick deliberate rhythm of hers, always a little faster than you might expect from someone who presents as unhurried, and he turned. Yui walked toward him along the path with her head tilted slightly down, which was not her usual way. She was the sort of person who normally met the world at eye level, chin up, unself-conscious, and this small departure registered in him the way small departures do, quietly, without urgency, but clearly enough. She sat beside him on the bench with the posture of someone who has been rehearsing something and is now doing their best not to let the rehearsal show in their body, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, just looked at the middle distance with an expression that could not quite make up its mind. Kenji waited. He had learned this over months of phone calls, that Yui moved at her own pace, that patience with her was not just appreciated but necessary, that if you waited without filling the silence she would always, eventually, say the thing she had come to say. The ginkgo leaves trembled overhead in a small wind that came and went, and the lamplight went on warming the gravel, and she sat beside him with her hands folded in her lap and her face turned toward the trees. And then she turned to look at him. Her face was red. Not the mild pink of someone who has walked quickly in cool air, not the brief color of surprise, but a deep, full, unmistakable scarlet that ran from her ears down to her chin, the kind of redness that happens when a feeling is too large and too honest to stay below the surface, when the body simply decides to make an announcement regardless of what you have planned. He had not seen it on her before, not in any of their improbable encounters, not at the inn, not at the souvenir shop, not even at the group dinner when things had been genuinely awkward, and he sat very still and looked at her, and waited. She held his gaze for a moment, the length of 2 or 3 slow breaths, long enough for him to understand that whatever she had come to say, she had decided to say it, and that this was costing her something real, and that she was going to pay it anyway. And then she looked back at the trees, and she told him. She said that somewhere in the middle of all those phone calls, somewhere between the long evenings and the odd questions and the answers she sometimes liked and sometimes argued with, she had come to like him, that the feeling had appeared without her permission and had stayed there, and she thought he ought to know. She said it quietly and steadily, in the tone of someone who has written the sentence in their head many times and is now reading it aloud for the first time ever, and her voice did not waver, which he would later think must have taken considerable effort. Kenji sat very still for a moment, listening to the echo of it settle in the evening air. He would admit honestly to himself, genuinely surprised, not because the idea had never crossed his mind in some peripheral and unexamined way, but because hearing it said plainly, in the open air, with the leaves going gold and Yui's face the color of a paper lantern, made it absolutely real in a way that half-formed thoughts never quite managed to be. He looked at her profile. She had not turned back toward him, was keeping her eyes fixed somewhere safely in the direction of the trees, and he noticed the careful stillness of her hands, the slight tension across her shoulders, the posture of someone who has done the brave thing and is now simply waiting to find out what happens next. Something moved in him, slow and warm, a thing he had not been expecting to feel. It was the way she looked while she said it. He would think later, the complete absence of calculation, the total unguardedness of it, the sense that she had not dressed it up or cushioned it or softened it into something easier to manage. She had simply said the plain true version of it, and then sat there with her face on fire and waited to find out what would happen. There is something rare in that kind of honesty. He found himself thinking, not the honesty of someone who is strategically forthcoming, not the honesty of someone performing sincerity for an audience, but the kind that has no angle attached to it, no safety net, no fallback position prepared, just the truth, standing out in the open, taking its chances. He thought about the trip, briefly, the sheer improbability of all of it, the way none of this was supposed to happen, the way two people from the same city had had to travel to the same inn at the same time and then navigate one spectacular misadventure after another before ending up here, on this particular bench, in this particular park, in the autumn lamplight. He thought about the izakaya, the 2 seats between them, and how she had been making a very considerable spectacle of her feelings about someone else entirely, and how none of it had seemed significant at the time, and how very thoroughly wrong that had turned out to be. He thought about the group dinner, how she had gone almost completely quiet from the moment she sat down, how she had leaned slightly toward him whenever the conversation got too loud, as if finding in him something familiar enough to be a small shelter, and how he had interpreted this, at the time, as simply proximity, simply the comfort of a known face. The ginkgo leaves moved overhead, and somewhere beyond the gate a bicycle passed on the street outside, its bell ringing once, and the lamppost went on casting its warm circle on the gravel, and Yui sat beside him with her face still burning and her hands still folded, and waited. Kenji said yes. He said it without ceremony, because it seemed to him like the kind of moment that did not need ceremony, that needed instead the same quality of plainness that she had brought to it, the same absence of performance. He said it and meant it, which was the part that surprised him most, not the yes itself, but how completely and immediately he meant it, how there was no hesitation behind the word, no part of him that needed any further convincing. Yui was quiet for a moment that had a particular texture to it, the texture of relief and embarrassment arriving at the same time and not quite knowing which one to let go of first. Then she said something very small, barely audible, something that might have been a thank you, or might have been the sound that gratitude makes before it locates its words, and her face, impossibly, went a shade deeper than it already was. He felt a smile move through him before it reached his face, the kind that is not quite happiness, or not only that, but something harder to name. The small stunned warmth of finding yourself somewhere you had not planned to be and realizing, without any drama about it, that this is the right place. They sat together on the bench a while longer, as the evening went on deepening around them in the slow patient way evenings do, and there was not much more that needed saying, and so they said very little, and it was enough. What came after was its own quiet education. He had known in a general way that Yui was not easy with men. She had told him as much in those months of phone calls, mentioned the all-girls high school and the women's university and the way the ordinary social world of grown men felt to her like a room she had never been given the floor plan to. But there had been a version of her he had come to know over the phone, quick with words, opinionated, capable of talking at some speed about things she felt strongly about, and he had perhaps assumed, without fully examining the assumption, that this was the version that would arrive to their relationship. She did not arrive. The Yui who became his girlfriend was someone quieter and more careful. She chose her words with a deliberateness she had not previously bothered with, held herself with a shyness so thoroughgoing it seemed almost structural, like something built into her before you knew her. She would start to say something and then stop, recalibrate, begin again more softly. She would find something to do with her hands when they sat together. She would look at him from a slight angle when she spoke, as if looking directly might be a great deal all at once. He asked her about it, gently, trying not to make her self-conscious about being self-conscious, which is a particular kind of difficulty. She told him it was different, that being a girlfriend was different from being a friend, that something in the change had changed everything else along with it, and that she was embarrassed in a way she could neither account for nor argue herself out of. It was every time, she told him, every time, this embarrassment, not just in the beginning but reliably and consistently, as if it had taken up permanent residence and saw no reason to leave. He believed her, because he could see it plainly, the color that would appear in her cheeks at the start of an ordinary afternoon together, the way she would be talking easily about something and then suddenly become aware of him listening and lose the thread entirely and have to look away. He found this, and he was honest enough with himself to name it enormously endearing, in a way he had not predicted and could not have designed if he tried. There is something in genuine shyness, not shyness as performance, not shyness deployed strategically, but the real unpracticed kind, unmanageable and completely sincere, that gets past your defenses in a way that confidence sometimes cannot, because it makes no argument for itself, asks for nothing, simply is. He kept his distance from any closeness she had not indicated she was ready for, kept the pace of things slow, gave her the room to set the terms of each small thing, and did not push against any boundary he could sense she had not yet decided what to do with. There was a patience in him that he genuinely had not known was there, a capacity to slow down and simply wait that had not previously featured in his understanding of himself, and he discovered it now without fanfare, found it simply available when he reached for it, the way sometimes the right quality in you appears when someone needs it. He was careful, too, about physical closeness, kept to himself more than he might have otherwise, and this cost him something, which he accepted without making an announcement of it, because some things are worth the cost. 2 weeks after that evening in the park, they had been to dinner somewhere quiet and come out into the night air, which had come down properly dark and a little cool, the way autumn nights do when they are being honest about what season is arriving. He walked her back the way they often did, no particular hurry, and when they reached the corner where she usually turned toward her apartment there was a pause, the kind that has a shape to it, a particular quality you recognize even in the middle of it, and he kissed her. Just briefly, just quietly, the kind of first kiss that happens without announcing itself, without making a statement, simply arriving and then being over. And when he stepped back and looked at her, her face was red. The same red as the bench under the ginkgo trees, from ears to chin, full and complete and unmistakable, the blush of someone whose feelings have once again decided to announce themselves without waiting for permission. She looked at him for a moment with that expression, and then looked away, and he thought that he would probably remember this for a very long time. She was genuine, was the word he kept coming back to, because it was the most accurate one, the one that fit without leaving gaps. Not genuine in the mild sense, the polite sense, the sense where you use it to mean well-intentioned or likable, but genuine in the original and more demanding sense. What was inside came to the surface, undistorted and unfiltered, whether she had planned for it to or not. The blush did not come because she had decided to seem endearing, it came because the feeling came, and the feeling came because it was real, and there was no gap between those three things, no room where calculation could have entered, no moment where she could have chosen to be otherwise. He had met people who were charming, and people who were kind, and people who were interesting in the way that interesting people are, but he had not met many, in all the ordinary years of his ordinary life, of whom it could be said with any confidence that what you saw was simply and entirely what was there. There was something in that which settled in him without making a fuss about it, the way things do when they are going to stay. He thought sometimes, in the quiet of early mornings before the day had started, about the sequence of small disasters that had led here, the wrong door, the wrong futon, the stranger's voice raised in shock, the long mortified day that followed. He had spent every minute of that day wanting to be somewhere else entirely, had felt the whole miserable series of events like something heavy he was being made to carry. And yet every single piece of it had been necessary, in the event, for anything else to follow. Remove any one moment and the thread simply stops, goes nowhere, and he goes on being someone who never sat under ginkgo trees in autumn with Yui's face burning red in the lamplight. He did not use words like fate or destiny, they seemed to him too certain and too grand for the small and accidental way that real things actually arrange themselves. But connection, the quiet fact of it, the way it runs between two people across improbable distances and through circumstances that no one would have designed on purpose, and comes out the other side still intact, that, he believed in. On the bench, under the ginkgo trees, with her face burning scarlet and her voice coming out steady anyway, that had been the connection making itself known, the thread pulling taut between two people who had every reason to have nothing to do with each other. He had said yes because the yes was already there before she had finished saying what she came to say, already true in the way some things are true before you have formally decided they will be. And she had gone red right down to her collar, and said something very small and warm, and looked away into the trees, and the evening had gone on being what evenings are, quiet, and unhurried, and not requiring anything further of anyone. That is the kind of thing that is difficult to explain to someone who wasn't there, the kind of story that loses something in the retelling because the center of it is not the events themselves but a feeling, the particular feeling of a face turned away in the lamplight, and the quality of a blush that belongs only to someone who cannot help meaning what they feel. Some things you carry with you, warm and intact, simply because there is no better place for them. And the park, and the bench, and the autumn evening, and Yui's burning face looking away at the ginkgo trees, that was one of those things, held somewhere quiet and returned to now and then, when a person needs to remember that the world, even the improbable and poorly organized world, sometimes knows exactly what it is doing. And so we leave that hallway behind, its quiet shadows settling, its story breathing softly into the dark where all stories eventually rest. There is no need to hold on to it, let it drift, the way a candle flame bends and releases its thin ribbon of smoke into the ceiling. You have nowhere to be. The night is still wide and unhurried around you. Take a slow breath in, and let it go without effort. The same night continues now, the same darkness holding us gently, as our next story unfolds from the very same hours, a different door, a different voice, and yet the same stillness threading through it all, pulling you a little deeper into the quiet. Now they were together, which was the right word for it, and the first thing that seemed to mean was a certain careful distance he had decided, without making any particular announcement, to keep. He found himself being patient, not the waiting at a traffic light variety, the passive kind that asks nothing of you, but the sort that requires a daily choice, the sort that means noticing an impulse and letting it rest, deciding that the thing you might be hurrying toward is worth arriving at slowly, and making that decision again the following morning, and the morning after that. And then, just when he thought he had understood something of who she was, Yui went quiet in a way she had not been before. This required some adjustment, because the Yui he had known until that bench in September, the one who phoned at 10 in the evening to ask what it meant when a man sent a message with too many exclamation points, who talked in long branching sentences about the incomprehensible interior of the adult male, who had treated him essentially as an anthropological resource on the subject of men, that Yui simply folded herself smaller when they were together now, spoke in shorter sentences, looked at the spaces slightly to the side of his face rather than directly at him. She explained it once, in a roundabout way, mentioned that it was different now, that there was something strange about it that hadn't been strange before, that being looked at by him now seemed to carry a weight it hadn't carried when he was only someone who happened to know things about how men thought. He told her that was perfectly fine, that they could take things as slowly as she needed, and she nodded at the table. They were at the family restaurant by then, the laminated menu, plastic cup of oolong tea booth that had already become, without any official nomination, their place, and he recognized, in the quality of that nod, that she was not apologizing for the pace, just naming it honestly, and that this honesty was its own kind of intimacy. He understood, by then, something of the landscape of her experience, the girls' high school, the women's university, the years of social life conducted almost entirely without men in it, the first confession she had made to a man who had treated it as an opening rather than a gift, the swift and decisive end of that, and he held all of this the way you hold something that belongs to someone else, with two hands and without pressing. So he walked beside her in the evenings and kept his hands in his jacket pockets, not because nothing occurred to him, because things did occur to him with some regularity, but because he let those thoughts pass without acting on them, and the walking itself was good, the streets were good, the October evenings with their vending machines making small blue light and the warm smell of cooking drifting down from the windows above the narrow lanes. They walked without much purpose, past the convenience store and the dry cleaner and the small shrine tucked between two buildings, where someone had left an offering that morning and the stone was still dark with yesterday's rain, and sometimes they talked easily and sometimes they didn't, and he came to find that both were acceptable, which was itself one of the things he was learning. He noticed things on those walks, the way she occasionally pointed out something along the way with an open, unreserved enthusiasm, a cat sitting on a wall, a shop sign in an old font, the moon appearing unexpectedly over a roofline, and he liked this about her, this small reflex of noticing, this pointing at things she found worth pointing at. She had a habit, when they sat across from each other, of stirring her tea long after it needed stirring, a slow circling of the plastic straw, eyes on the cup rather than on him, and he had come to understand this as a kind of thinking posture, the sign of someone present and also somewhere interior, quietly working something out, and he had stopped trying to fill those silences and had started simply sitting in them, which turned out to be its own kind of closeness. There were evenings when she talked easily, the way she had before any of this changed, in long, wandering sentences about things that had happened at work, films she'd seen, small observations about people on the train, and he liked those evenings for their ease, for the sense that whatever strangeness the new arrangement had introduced was receding slowly in the direction of something more settled. And there were evenings when she was simply shy and he was simply beside her, and he found he liked those evenings too, perhaps differently, liked them for the quality of the quiet, and for what the quiet suggested, which was that she trusted him enough to be exactly where she was without feeling she needed to cover for it. The city had its own character in those October evenings, a low warmth in the lamps, a faintly autumnal smell in the air after rain, the early dark of that season in a city, street lamps coming on before 5, and he would think sometimes, walking back from wherever they had been, that this particular combination of circumstances was teaching him something about patience that he had not known he needed to learn. 2 weeks into their being together, they stood outside her building on an evening cold enough that their breath showed faintly in the light of the entrance lamp, doing the small habitual delay of people who are not quite ready for good night, talking about something he could not later have named, the way you sometimes cannot recall the specific words of a conversation that mattered quite a lot for entirely other reasons. She was looking at the ground to the side of her shoes, which was her particular habit in moments of uncertainty, and he found himself thinking that the moment was simply here, quiet as it was, and that he was going to let it happen. He leaned toward her slowly, without any of the haste that makes such moments clumsy, and kissed her there under the entrance lamp, with the cold air around them and the faint sound of a television audible somewhere above, and a bicycle bell ringing once in the lane and fading into the general quiet of the neighborhood. She let him, and for a moment neither of them moved at all. When he stepped back, her face was its most thoroughly red, not the red of embarrassment in its ordinary form, not quite the red of any emotion he could name neatly, but the red of a person experiencing something they have no previous map for, feeling their way into new territory without a guide, and she did not say anything for long enough that the lamp buzzed softly in the silence and the cold air finished settling around them. Then she looked up, and the expression was one he had not seen from her before, open, without any of the sideways glancing or the lowered eyes, just a clear and slightly wondering look, as though she was checking whether what she was feeling was visible, and had decided, somewhere in the quiet of that moment, that she didn't particularly mind if it was. He would think about that moment many times in the years after, not because it was grand or dramatic, it was in fact quite small, just two people standing under a lamp in the cold, but because of the quality of that silence, and of her expression in it, the way it had contained nothing strategic, nothing guarded, just the plain and unmediated fact of what she felt. Pause. He walked home that night along the longer route, the one that took him past the shrine and the river path where the reeds were tall and pale in the lamplight, and he thought about her face in that moment under the entrance lamp, and what he felt was not excitement exactly, but its slower and warmer relative, the feeling of something settling into the place it was going to occupy for a long time. The months that followed were the months in which he came to understand, gradually and without any single revelation, who Yui was beneath the shyness and the blushing and the occasional startled retreat, came to see that the quietness was not the whole of her, that inside it was someone quite clear-headed and quite decided, someone who knew what she thought and said so when it counted, someone whose care for the things she cared about was practical and total and entirely without flourish. There was the winter cold he got, a proper one, the kind that makes the ceiling seem very distant and the glass of water on the nightstand feel genuinely out of reach, and she took annual leave from work, which she did not do lightly, and appeared on a Tuesday afternoon with soup from the convenience store and tablets from the pharmacy and a calm, unhurried manner that said she intended to stay and help and was not going to make a production of either. She sat in the chair beside his bed and read quietly while he slept, and was there when he woke, and refilled the glass when it needed refilling, and left when evening came with the calm efficiency of someone who has done what they came to do and requires no particular acknowledgement, and he lay in the dark afterward thinking that this very specific quality of showing up and simply staying without drama or decoration, was something he valued more than he yet had proper words for. It occurred to him, in the quiet after she had gone, that she was not someone who loved in a demonstrative or declarative way. She did not easily say the things, she simply did them, the showing up being the saying, and he understood, lying there thinking it over, that this was how she was made, and that it was exactly enough. They learned each other's shapes over those months, the small frictions and the small surprises, the things that needed adjustment and the things that turned out to be exactly as they had seemed, and what he came to understand, through all of it, was that Yui was built along a single line, that when she committed to something she went all the way in, without reservation or condition, which was a quality he had not known he was looking for but recognized immediately on finding it. The proposal, when it came, was not elaborate. He was not an elaborate person, and she would not have wanted elaborate, and she said yes with her face doing its familiar and entirely beloved thing, and he found himself thinking, somewhere in the background of that moment, that he hoped it would keep doing that for a long time yet, that particular helpless and unguarded sincerity. The wedding was attended by people they both actually wanted in the room, which is a harder thing to arrange than most people account for, and afterward came the new ordinary, the apartment with its particular sounds, the rhythm of two lives finding their accommodation with each other, the quiet domestic arithmetic of evenings and mornings, and who makes the coffee and whose turn it is to check the post. He thought about it sometimes, in the evenings of their life together, the whole chain of it, from the wrong room all the way to this, and what struck him, returning to it, was not its improbability, though it was genuinely improbable, but its specific and necessary shape. The fact that if any single piece were removed the whole thing quietly came apart. If he had not been quite that drunk, on quite that evening, nothing. If the lobby the following morning had been arranged differently, if the tourist area had offered more restrooms and he had not needed that particular one, if the souvenir shop argument had dissolved more quietly and the two groups had simply dispersed without anyone's pride becoming involved, any one of those adjustments alone would have been sufficient to reroute everything, to redirect two people away from each other so completely that neither would ever have known what had been narrowly missed. And the izakaya, if he had not, on that particular unremarkable evening, wanted a drink and wandered into that particular street and settled at that particular section of the bar, she would have remained the woman from the wrong room, a mildly mortifying memory, A story he occasionally told about a terrible trip, and nothing more. He was not, by temperament, someone who reached easily for the language of fate or destiny. He had always found such framings a little too convenient, a little too willing to smooth the genuine disorder of actual living into something neater than it was, but he had come to allow himself something softer, something like the quiet sense that people and their circumstances seem, sometimes, to return to each other, the way a melody keeps finding its note until finally, gently, it resolves. What he knew, in the evenings of their ordinary life, was simpler than any framework he might have offered. It was just the lamp on the table and the sound of Yui somewhere in the apartment and the particular warmth of a life that had arrived by the most implausible route and turned out, at the end of all its accidents, to be exactly what was needed. He thought of himself sometimes, the younger self, the one carrying rather more rice wine than was advisable, who had opened a door in complete confidence that it was his own and lay down in the wrong futon with the peaceable certainty of someone who has no idea what he is about to cause, and felt toward him something that took a while to name but turned out, on reflection, to be a kind of tender and slightly awed gratitude. That man, blundering, barely dressed, entirely unaware, had managed to stumble into something that the careful, sober, correctly navigating version of himself might never have found, or might have found only much later and by a route far more deliberate and far less interesting than the one that had actually been taken. And so, quietly, in the way you feel grateful for something you cannot quite say out loud because it sounds too unlikely and too lucky, he was grateful for the rice wine, for the wrong door, for the lobby and the shrine and the souvenir shop and the late-night bar and the pointed finger and all of it, every clumsy and undignified piece of a story that had been quietly, all along, in the business of going somewhere. That is where this story rests, then, not in the chaos of its beginning, not in the list of its mishaps, each of which was real and each of which turned out to be necessary, but in what the beginning was quietly arranging, without either of them knowing it. A life, a lamp, an ordinary evening, a person who still, sometimes, in the warmth of an ordinary room, goes a particular and entirely genuine shade of red, and everything, between the two of them, that turned out to be exactly enough. And so we come to the end of tonight's stories. These quiet voices from Japan, the worries, the wonders, the small moments people carried alone until they set them down in words, have traveled a long way to reach you here, in the dark, in the stillness of wherever you are resting tonight. Thank you for spending these hours with us. There is something gentle about sharing a night this way, even across distances, even in silence. If sleep has not yet found you, let it come now. There is nothing left that needs your attention. The stories are told, the voices have gone quiet, and all that remains is your breath, and the softness of wherever you have laid your head. May your dreams carry you somewhere easy. May you wake slowly, into a morning that asks nothing of you too soon. And if you find your way back here on another night, more stories will be waiting, patient and unhurried, just as they were tonight. Rest well. Good night.